Don't mind her. She lives off our parents and cannot hold a job. My brother laughed, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo while his groomsmen snickered. I kept my mouth shut and bent down to pick up a fallen silk tie. But I was too slow. My sleeve rode up, exposing the jagged, deep tissue burn and shrapnel scar running from my wrist to my elbow. His best man, a hardened former Army Ranger, saw it. The blood drained from his face. He instantly snapped to attention, pulled out his phone, and stepped into the corner to make an urgent call. 30 minutes later, the doors of that upscale tailor shop would blow wide open, and my family would finally learn exactly who had been funding their lavish, pathetic lives. My name is Nora, and I am 33 years old. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family while secretly carrying the weight of their survival on your back, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button and like this video if you believe toxic families always get what they deserve. Because what happened next completely dismantled my arrogant brother and the fake empire he built. We were at one of the most exclusive tailor shops in downtown Seattle. My brother Brandon, who was 36 and insufferably arrogant, was getting fitted for his upcoming wedding. The whole affair was slated to cost upwards of $200,000. He had brought his 6 groomsmen to get measured for their custom suits. I was only there because my mother had guilt-tripped me into running errands for the wedding party. I stood quietly in the corner wearing plain black athletic wear, holding garment bags and trying to stay out of the way. Brandon was holding court in the center of the room, standing on a velvet pedestal, while a tailor pinned the hem of his trousers. He loved an audience. He had just finished bragging about his latest venture capital deal when one of the groomsmen, a guy named Todd, looked over at me. Todd asked Brandon why I was not dressed up for the occasion. Brandon waved a dismissive hand in my direction and sneered. "Do not mind Nora. She is the family charity case. She lives off mom and dad. She cannot even hold down a minimum wage job. She just sits in her apartment all day playing video games." The groomsmen chuckled. A few looked at me with open pity, while others shook their heads. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but kept my face entirely blank. I had trained myself to show zero emotion in high-stress situations. Let them laugh, I thought. Let Brandon inflate his fragile ego by stepping on me. He had been doing it since we were kids. He always needed to be the golden child. And my parents had always enabled it, painting me as the troubled, unemployed daughter who needed constant financial support. The tailor accidentally knocked a silver tray off a side table, sending silk ties scattering across the floor. My reflexes kicked in. I dropped to one knee, reaching out to gather the fabrics. As I stretched my arm forward, the cuff of my athletic jacket snagged on a heavy leather chair. The fabric pulled back violently, riding up to my elbow. I froze. I normally took extreme precautions to keep my arms covered. The harsh lighting beamed down directly on my right forearm. There, running from my wrist past my elbow, was a massive jagged scar. It was a chaotic mix of deep burns and clustered shrapnel wounds. It was the distinct, brutal signature of high-explosive combat trauma. I quickly yanked my sleeve down, but it was too late. Wyatt, Brandon's best man, stood less than 3 feet away. He was a towering, broad-shouldered guy who moved with the quiet precision of someone who had seen combat. Brandon had boasted earlier that Wyatt was a decorated former Army Ranger. Wyatt had been casually sipping bourbon. But the moment his eyes locked onto my exposed arm, he stopped breathing. The color drained from his face. His jaw went slack. The whiskey glass tipped, spilling amber drops onto the Persian rug. He recognized that pattern of scarring. He knew what weapon caused that damage, and he knew civilians do not survive those blasts. The bustling noise of the shop faded into a vacuum. Wyatt stared at me, his eyes wide with terrifying recognition. A ghost from his past had suddenly materialized. Without a word, Wyatt snapped his boots together. His posture shifted instantly to rigid military attention. He slowly set his glass down. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out his smartphone and turned his back to the group. He walked briskly to the corner of the room, pressing the phone to his ear with intense urgency. Brandon looked over his shoulder and laughed loudly. "What are you doing, Wyatt? Calling your broker to buy stock because I look so good?" Brandon chuckled at his own joke. Wyatt completely ignored him. He stood with his broad shoulders rigid, speaking in rapid, frantic whispers into the receiver. I could not hear the words, but I saw the tension radiating through his body. He was making a priority call. I stood up slowly, placing the gathered ties back onto the tray. I adjusted my jacket sleeve, ensuring it was securely pulled down to my wrist. Brandon rolled his eyes and muttered something about Wyatt always being too serious. But I knew better. I knew exactly what Wyatt had seen, and I knew exactly who he was calling. The perfectly constructed lie my brother and parents had built was about to shatter. They had convinced everyone I was a worthless dependent. But 30 minutes later, the front doors of that shop would fly open, bringing a reckoning that would permanently destroy my brother's arrogant world. The tense silence in the upscale tailor shop was abruptly broken by the sharp clearing of a throat. The head tailor stepped forward, balancing a silver tray that held several heavy leather-bound receipt folders. While Wyatt remained facing the corner window with his smartphone pressed hard against his ear, Brandon stepped down from his velvet-fitting pedestal. He adjusted the lapels of his custom shirt and turned his attention to the groomsman standing to his immediate left. This was Jamal. Jamal was 34 years old, a dedicated African-American high school history teacher and the fiercely loyal husband of my younger sister Emily. He was also the favorite target of my family's relentless elitism. Jamal had always been treated like a second-class citizen by my parents and my arrogant brother. He was kind, highly intelligent, and deeply devoted to my sister. But in my family's eyes, his modest public school salary and his racial background made him a permanent outsider. They never missed an opportunity to remind him that he did not truly belong in their wealthy, status-obsessed world. Today was going to be no different. The tailor nervously handed Jamal one of the leather folders. Jamal opened it, and I saw his broad shoulders instantly stiffen. His dark eyes locked onto the final total printed at the bottom of the premium invoice. $3,000. It was an absurd, astronomical price for a groomsman suit. Brandon had purposefully selected a bespoke Italian designer without consulting a single person about the budget. He wanted the wedding party to look like a two-page spread in a luxury lifestyle magazine, regardless of the severe financial strain it placed on the people standing next to him. Jamal closed the folder slowly. He looked directly at Brandon, keeping his voice low and respectful, desperately trying to preserve his dignity. Brandon, we talked about this extensively last month. You explicitly said the groomsmen suits were being rented for $300. Emily and I have a strict budget right now with the new baby on the way. I cannot drop $3,000 on a suit I will only wear for 6 hours. Brandon did not lower his voice. In fact, he spoke louder, ensuring every man in the room could hear every single word. Renting. Brandon scoffed, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh. I am not having my wedding party wearing cheap polyester rentals. This is a high society event, Jamal. Not one of those backyard barbecues you are so used to attending. I told everyone to upgrade their look. If you cannot afford to stand next to me, maybe you should step down and just sit in the back row with the regular guests. Jamal swallowed hard. His jaw clenched tightly. I could see the profound humiliation washing over him, but he held his ground. You changed the plan without telling me, Brandon. I am a public history teacher. My salary goes toward our mortgage and Emily's rising medical bills. $3,000 is not pocket change for us. Brandon smirked, crossing his arms over his perfectly tailored chest. He leaned in, delivering a string of thinly veiled racist microaggressions disguised as financial advice. Look, it is not my fault you chose to work for absolute pennies. Maybe if you spent less time complaining about systemic disadvantages and more time actually hustling in the real world, you could afford to dress properly. You are supposed to be a provider for my sister. Instead, you are dragging Emily down into poverty. Mom and Dad are constantly worried sick that they will have to bail you two out when you inevitably default on your house. You should be embarrassed. The other groomsmen shifted uncomfortably. Nobody intervened. They were all too intimidated by Brandon's wealth and his aggressive persona to speak up for what was right. Jamal looked down at the receipt folder in his hands. The absolute defeat in his posture made my blood boil. He reached into his worn leather wallet, his fingers hesitating over a standard bank debit card. I knew it would bounce. I knew the crushing shame that would immediately follow when the cashier declined the transaction. I stepped forward. I did not raise my voice or make a dramatic scene. I simply walked over to Jamal, gently took the leather folder from his hands, and approached the cashier counter. Jamal looked at me in total confusion. Nora, what are you doing? Do not worry about this. I ignored his protest and reached into my athletic jacket. I pulled out a sleek, unbranded black metal credit card. It was noticeably heavy, devoid of any commercial bank logos or spending limits. It was an elite corporate account card tied directly to my private tactical firm. I placed it squarely on the glass counter. Put the 3,000 on this, I told the cashier quietly, and prepay all the alteration fees. Before the cashier could even reach for the heavy metal card, a hand slammed violently down on the counter. Brandon stormed over, his face flushed with intense indignation. He swatted his hand aggressively, slapping my black metal card right off the glass. It clattered sharply against the hardwood floor. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Brandon hissed, leaning his tall frame over me. "You do not get to play the rich savior here. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing me." I looked down at the card resting on the floor, then slowly back up at my brother. My expression remained entirely neutral, a mask of absolute calm. "I am paying for Jamal's suit. You changed the budget without warning him. It is handled. Now back off." Brandon let out a loud, theatrical sigh, turning to the groomsmen to make sure they were fully watching the show. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are paying for it with what money?" "Nora, are you seriously trying to use Mom and Dad's emergency allowance to buy a suit? You think we do not know they transfer money into your sad little account every single month just so you do not starve in the streets?" He stepped closer, invading my personal space. "You are a complete fraud." Brandon sneered, his breath hot and aggressive against my face. "You live off our parents. You contribute absolutely nothing to this family. You are a broken, unemployed loser playing with Daddy's money. Do not you dare try to act like you are on my level. Jamal needs to learn his place in this family, and so do you." Jamal stepped up immediately, placing a firm, protective hand on my shoulder. "Nora, do not do this. High is not worth it. I will figure it out. Please just put the card away." I did not break eye contact with Brandon. The absolute certainty in his eyes was almost comical to witness. He truly believed I was a helpless parasite clinging to our parents for survival. He truly believed his fake venture capital success made him an untouchable king. He had absolutely no idea that the very allowance he was mocking me about was a complete fabrication. He had no idea that I was the one secretly funding his entire luxurious, fraudulent lifestyle. I calmly bent down and retrieved my heavy black metal card from the hardwood floor. I wiped a tiny speck of dust from the titanium edge. I did not yell. I did not defend myself to these men. I just smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made Brandon pause for a fraction of a second. "You are right, Brandon," I said softly, my voice carrying a lethal, quiet calm. "We definitely need to talk about Mom and Dad's money. We should talk about all of it." I slipped the metal card back into my jacket pocket. Across the room, Wyatt finally lowered his phone from his ear. He turned around slowly to face the group. His military posture was completely rigid, his jaw set in stone. He looked at Brandon like he was looking at a dead man walking. The countdown had officially begun, and the impending explosion was going to wipe out my brother's entire fake empire without a trace of mercy. The heavy oak and glass door of the tailor shop swung open with a sharp chime cutting through the thick tension Brandon had just created. Thomas and Susan Gallagher marched inside like royalty inspecting their subjects. My parents were a matched set of engineered perfection, sporting fresh spray tans, tailored cashmere, and a terrifying sense of entitlement. Their arms were weighed down with glossy shopping bags from European luxury boutiques. They did not even glance at Jamal. They completely ignored Wyatt, who was still standing rigidly in the corner like a coiled spring, their eyes immediately locked onto their golden child. Susan practically threw her shopping bags onto a velvet-tufted sofa and rushed to embrace my brother. She fawned over the fabric of his suit, loudly declaring that he looked like a young billionaire. Thomas clapped Brandon on the shoulder, handing him a silver flask from his pocket, congratulating him on simply existing. I watched the display with utter detachment. It was the exact same performance they had rehearsed for over 3 decades. Brandon was the sun, and the rest of us were just lucky to stand in the outer orbit of his warmth. But the warm performance ended the second Susan turned around and locked her sharp, assessing eyes on me. Her smile vanished, replaced by a tight, strained line. She marched over to where I was standing near the cashier counter. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into the nylon fabric of my jacket, and pulled me forcefully toward a secluded alcove near the dressing rooms. Thomas followed closely behind, his posture shifting from a proud father to an imposing enforcer. They corralled me into the corner, completely shielding us from the view of the groomsmen. Jamal watched us from across the room with deep concern, but I gave him a subtle nod to stay put. Susan reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. She shoved it directly against my chest. "You need to sign this right now," she commanded, her voice dropping to an aggressive, hushed whisper. "Do not make a scene. Just take a pen from that desk and sign the bottom line." I did not take the paper. I let it fall from my chest and flutter down onto a small glass end table. "What is that?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Thomas stepped forward, invading my personal space. "It is the deed transfer for your downtown condo," he stated, crossing his arms. "Brandon and Paige need a suitable place to live after the wedding. That high-rise is located in the most prestigious zip code in Seattle. It is entirely wasted on you. You sit around doing nothing all day. Brandon is managing a venture capital firm and running a major charity. He needs a home that reflects his elite status. You are going to sign the deed over to him today as your wedding gift." I stared at my father, genuinely amazed by the sheer magnitude of his audacity. "You want me to sign over a luxury penthouse that I own outright, just so Brandon can play pretend for his new wife?" I asked. "It is not a request." Nora Susan hissed, her face turning an ugly shade of red. "You owe this family. We have given you everything. You are going to move out by the end of the month. You can find a cheap studio apartment in the suburbs. We will even help you pack. But Brandon deserves that penthouse. Paige refuses to move into anything less than a luxury property, and we are not going to let you ruin your brother's marriage before it even begins." "No," I said flatly. Thomas leaned down, his face mere inches from mine. His breath smelled of expensive cigars and bitter coffee. "You do not get to say no to me," he growled. "You are a complete embarrassment to the Gallagher name. If you do not sign that transfer right now, I will completely cut off your monthly allowance. I will sever your bank access. You will be entirely on your own. You will be homeless on the streets of Seattle by next week, and I will make sure nobody in this family helps you." I did not stop there. He wanted to inflict maximum damage. "You think you are so tough," Thomas mocked, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "That failed teenage rebellion of yours was the most pathetic thing I have ever witnessed. You ran off to play soldier because you could not handle real academic pressure. And look what it got you. It left you physically mangled and mentally broken. You are a useless, damaged burden. The military chewed you up and spit you out, and we were the ones who had to take you back in. If we cut your funding, you have absolutely nothing. You are nothing." A suffocating silence fell over our little corner of the shop. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, the man who had just reduced my grueling service, my sacrifices, and my literal shed blood to a pathetic joke. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not defend the honor of my unit or tell him about the lives I had saved in the Korengal Valley. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was a cold, calculating smile that made my mother instinctively take a half step back. Right on cue, my smartwatch vibrated against my wrist. I raised my arm, pulling back my sleeve just enough to check the glowing screen. It was an encrypted notification from Vanguard Tactical Solutions, confirming a massive offshore wire transfer. My parents stood there, chests puffed out, fully believing they held the ultimate sword over my head. They genuinely thought their monthly allowance was the only thing keeping me from starving. They thought they controlled my entire existence. They had absolutely no idea. The allowance Thomas was threatening to cut off was not his money, it was my money. 3 years ago, Thomas and Susan Gallagher had made a series of catastrophic, highly illegal financial blunders. They had secretly declared total bankruptcy. They were days away from losing their mansion, their cars, and their entire social standing. I had stepped in completely anonymously. I established a blind trust through my private security firm, routing a fabricated monthly income into their accounts so they could maintain their illusion of wealth. The money they haughtily transferred to me every month as my so-called allowance was quite literally just my own money bouncing back into my secondary checking account. I was funding their entire lives. I was paying the mortgage on the mansion they slept in. I was paying the lease on the luxury cars they drove to this very tailor shop. If they cut me off, they would automatically trigger a default on their own blind trust. They were threatening to hang me using a rope I was actively holding. I tapped the screen of my smartwatch, dismissing the notification. I looked back up at Thomason's, my smile widening into something lethal. "You are absolutely right, Dad," I said smoothly. "I think it is time we review my financial dependency on this family. We should cut the allowance immediately." Thomas sneered, thinking I was bluffing out of sheer desperation. Before he could deliver another insult, the entire atmosphere of the tailor shop shifted. The casual chatter of the groomsmen ceased entirely. Wyatt had moved from his corner and was now standing by the front entrance like a stone sentinel. The clock had struck 0. The 30 minutes were up. Brandon stepped out from the alcove, completely oblivious to the silent war that had just concluded between my parents and me. He smoothed the lapels of his unfinished suit jacket and projected his voice across the room, demanding the attention of every single person present. He loved nothing more than hearing himself speak, and he had a particular obsession with painting himself as a philanthropic savior. "Make sure the shoulders have enough room," Brandon instructed the head tailor with an arrogant wave of his hand. "I have a charity gala to host next week for the Veterans Support Fund. I will be shaking hands with the mayor and several key defense contractors. I need to look the part of a managing director who actually cares about giving back to the community." He turned to his groomsmen, chest puffed out with manufactured pride. "You guys know how it is. These broken veterans come back from deployment with nothing. No skills, no money. They rely on guys like me to establish venture capital funds to keep a roof over their heads. It is a heavy burden carrying that kind of financial responsibility, but someone has to look out for them." My smartwatch buzzed sharply against my wrist, delivering a second encrypted alert. I stepped out of the shadowed corner, leaving my parents staring at my back. I walked directly into the center of the showroom, positioning myself right behind my brother. "Is that so, Brandon?" I asked, my voice cutting through the soft classical music playing over the store speakers. "You are carrying a heavy burden for the veterans." Brandon let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled his eyes at the groomsman, pointing his thumb at me. "Here we go. The basement dweller has an opinion on high finance. Go sit down, Nora. Let the adults talk business." I did not sit down. Instead, I took a step closer. My posture completely relaxed, but my eyes locked onto him with the precision of a predator zeroing in on its prey. "I am just curious about the operational logistics of your charity," I said, tilting my head slightly. "For instance, why does a domestic veterans support fund require 3 offshore routing accounts in the Cayman Islands? And why did the latest audit report show a direct transfer of $400,000 from the charity escrow into your personal wealth management portfolio last Tuesday?" The entire shop went dead silent. The tailor stopped pinning the hem of Brandon's trousers. Jamal, standing by the register, raised his eyebrows in shock. Brandon froze. The smug, condescending smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted around the room, assessing who had heard me. He quickly forced a harsh, nervous laugh, attempting to recover his composure. "You are completely insane," Brandon snapped, his voice pitching higher than usual. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You sit in your cheap apartment reading conspiracy theories on the internet all day. You do not understand the first thing about venture capital routing or tax-deferred charitable growth." He looked at his friends, desperately trying to rally his audience. "She is crazy. She has been mentally unstable for years. Just ignore her." I ignored his pathetic attempt at gaslighting. I took another step forward, closing the distance. "Tax-deferred growth?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational but razor-sharp. "Is that what you call using donor funds to pay the deposit on the luxury downtown penthouse you just tried to blackmail me into giving you? Is that what you call using stolen veteran relief money to finance your $200,000 wedding?" "Shut your mouth!" Brandon roared, his face turning a violent shade of red. He took an aggressive step toward me, raising his hand, as if he might actually strike me to silence the accusations. Before his foot could even hit the floor, a massive shadow fell across the room. Wyatt had finished his phone call. He stepped away from the corner window and moved with terrifying silent speed. He did not return to his drink. He did not rejoin the groomsmen. Instead, he marched directly to the front entrance of the tailor shop. He turned the deadbolt lock on the glass door with a loud, resounding click, sealing us all inside. Then Wyatt turned around. He crossed his massive muscular arms over his broad chest and planted his feet shoulder-width apart. He stood there like an absolute fortress, physically blocking the only exit. His eyes bypassed the groomsmen. Groomsmen bypassed my parents and locked entirely onto Brandon. The look on Wyatt's face was not just anger. It was pure, unfiltered, homicidal hatred. It was the look of a combat veteran who had just realized he was standing in the same room as a traitor. Brandon noticed Wyatt blocking the door. He completely misread the situation, assuming his best man was securing the room to protect him from my so-called crazy outburst. "Thanks, Wyatt," Brandon muttered, adjusting his collar and trying to regain his composure. "Do not let her leave until she apologizes. My sister has lost her mind." Wyatt did not say a single word. He did not nod. He just continued staring at Brandon, a muscle ticking in his jaw, waiting for the inevitable execution. I turned my attention back to my brother. "Let us talk about the anonymous angel investor," I said smoothly, watching the sweat begin to form on his forehead. "The one who just injected $2 million into your veterans fund last month. The one you have been bragging about to every socialite in Seattle. That is highly confidential corporate information," Brandon stammered, backing away slightly. "That investor believes in my vision. They trust my financial leadership." "They do not trust you at all," I replied, my voice dropping to a chilling register. "They set a trap for you. That $2 million did not come from an anonymous angel investor. It came from a highly classified corporate shell company. And that shell company placed an aggressive digital tracker on every single cent of that money." Brandon's breathing grew shallow. His eyes darted toward the locked front door, then back to my face. The confidence he had weaponized against me for his entire life was rapidly crumbling into dust. "The tracking protocol, activated the second the funds hit your account," I explained, relishing the absolute terror dawning in his eyes. "The shell company knows you transferred $50,000 to pay for your fiancé's cubic zirconia engagement ring. They know you spent $80,000 on custom floral arrangements for this wedding. They know you have not given a single dime to any actual veterans. You have been stealing from the exact people who bled for this country, and you thought nobody was watching." "You are lying," Brandon gasped, though his trembling hands told a completely different story. "You are just a broke, unemployed loser. You could not possibly know any of this." I checked my watch one last time. "I know everything, Brandon. Because the people tracking you do not just freeze accounts, they bring federal charges." The air in the room grew suffocatingly tight. Brandon looked at my parents silently, begging them to intervene and shut me down. But Thomas and Susan were still frozen in the alcove, paralyzed by the sheer detail of my accusations. They knew Brandon had money problems in the past, but the phrase federal charges seemed to root them to the hardwood floor. The standoff reached a boiling point. Brandon opened his mouth to scream another insult, desperately trying to preserve his fake empire. But he never got the chance to speak. The heavy silence was shattered by the sound of screeching tires pulling up directly outside the storefront, followed by the heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots marching toward the glass. The heavy rhythmic thud marching toward the glass did not belong to a tactical assault team. Not yet. Wyatt kept his imposing frame planted in front of the door, his jaw tight as he peered through the tinted storefront window. He reached out and unlocked the deadbolt with a sharp clack, pulling the heavy glass door open just enough to let the disturbance inside. It was Paige. Brandon's fiancée stormed into the tailor shop like a hurricane of entitlement, flanked by two burly private security guards carrying massive stacks of luxury hat boxes. The marching boots belonged to her hired muscle. Paige was dripping in designer labels, holding her smartphone high in the air as she live-streamed her entrance. She completely ignored the suffocating tension in the room. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that her future husband was currently sweating through his custom shirt cornered by his own lies. Paige stopped her recording and glared around the room. She flipped her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder and immediately locked eyes on me. Her lips curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. "Why is she still here?" Paige demanded, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Brandon, I told you I did not want your sister lingering around the fittings. She is ruining the entire vibe of the afternoon." Brandon swallowed hard, trying to force a reassuring smile. He walked over to Paige, attempting to put a hand on her waist to guide her away from me. Paige swatted his hand away. She marched right up to where I was standing, her eyes dragging up and down my athletic wear with profound revulsion. Then her gaze caught the edge of the jagged scar on my wrist that I had not fully covered. She actually gasped and took a dramatic step backward, holding a hand to her chest as if she had been physically assaulted by the sight of my skin. "That is exactly what I'm talking about," Paige hissed, her voice echoing off the mirrored walls. "That right there. Nora, you are officially excluded from all the professional wedding photos. I am paying a photographer $20,000 to capture a flawless high society aesthetic for my social media. I cannot have your mangled arm ruining the symmetry of my bridal party." I looked at her, my face completely devoid of emotion. "Excluded from the photos." "Yes, excluded," Paige snapped, crossing her arms. "You bring this horrible, unemployed, depressed energy everywhere you go. You refuse to wear makeup. You refuse to get a real job. You just drag everyone down with your pathetic sob stories. My followers expect perfection. They expect elite luxury. Having a scarred, jobless freeloader standing next to me in the cathedral will completely humiliate me. You will sit in the back pew during the ceremony, and you will not attend the reception." Jamal had heard enough. He stepped forward, putting himself between me and Paige. His deep voice resonated with righteous anger. "You are out of line, Paige. Nora is Brandon's sister. You do not get to dictate her worth or exclude her from family photos just because she does not fit your superficial internet aesthetic. You should be ashamed of yourself for speaking to her that way." Paige slowly turned her head to look at Jamal. Her expression was laced with the kind of toxic, quiet racism that my family had specialized in for decades. She looked him up and down, her lip curling into a smirk of pure disdain. "Excuse me," Paige said, her voice dripping with venom. "Who exactly do you think you are talking to? You are a public school teacher, Jamal. You make what, $50,000 a year? You cannot even afford the suit you are wearing today. You should be down on your knees thanking Brandon that you were even invited to a wedding of this caliber. Do not you dare raise your voice to me. Know your place." Jamal clenched his fists at his sides, his chest heaving with restrained fury. I stepped around him gently, placing my hand on his arm to stand him down. I did not need Jamal to take the fall for me. I was perfectly capable of dismantling Paige all by myself. I looked at Paige. I looked at the massive glittering stone sitting on her left ring finger. She caught me looking and immediately flashed her hand, making sure the store lights caught the facets of the rock. "You like it," Paige mocked, flashing a cruel smile. "It is 5 carats, flawless. Brandon custom ordered it from Antwerp. It is a symbol of a man who actually knows how to provide, something you will never experience, Nora." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was not a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of someone holding a winning lottery ticket. 5 carats, I repeated slowly, my eyes locking onto the stone. Flawless. That is a very interesting description for a piece of cubic zirconia. The air vanished from the room. Paige froze, her arrogant smile shattering instantly. "What did you just say?" I took a step closer to her. "I said your ring is completely fake, Paige. It is a lab-grown piece of cubic zirconia. Brandon bought it online for exactly $850. "You are a jealous, psychotic liar," Paige screamed, clutching her hand to her chest. "Brandon spent a fortune on this diamond. He showed me the appraisal papers." I shook my head, keeping my voice utterly calm and level. "He showed you forged papers, Paige. I know exactly how much that ring cost, because Brandon bought it using the family's joint credit line. The same joint credit line that is linked directly to my banking alerts. I watched the transaction process 4 months ago. He even financed that $850 over a 12-month payment plan. because he did not have the liquid cash to buy fake jewelry outright. Paige turned a violent, blotchy shade of purple. Her eyes darted frantically toward Brandon, who was currently shrinking against a display rack of silk ties. "Brandon, tell her she is lying," Paige demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "Tell this crazy loser that my ring is real. Tell her right now." Brandon rushed forward, grabbing Paige by the shoulders. His eyes were wild with desperation. He immediately deployed his favorite tactic. He began gaslighting her with breathtaking speed. "Paige, baby, listen to me," Brandon pleaded, his voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. "Nora is insane. You know she is insane. She has been off her medication for weeks. She is just insanely jealous of you because you are beautiful and successful, and she has nothing. She is making up insane lies to try and ruin our special day. Do not listen to a word she says. My father and I are dealing with her right now." Paige looked down at her ring, then back at Brandon, her breathing ragged. She desperately wanted to believe him. She needed to believe the illusion of wealth was real. She glared at me, her face twisted with pure hatred. "You are sick, Nora. You are a sick, twisted person. You are just trying to destroy my happiness because you are a miserable freak." I simply smiled at her. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not try to convince her further. I knew that within a matter of minutes, the cubic zirconia on her finger would be the absolute least of her problems. Because my smartwatch had just vibrated again, and this time the heavy rhythmic thudding outside the shop was not a pair of hired security guards. It was the sound of federal justice finally arriving to collect its dues. Before the impending reality outside the glass could fully materialize, a heavy, suffocating grip clamped down on my bicep. My father Thomas had seen enough of the spectacle unfolding between Brandon and Paige. His face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. He yanked me backward, his fingers digging painfully into my muscle. He dragged me away from the center of the room, pushing me deep into the narrow, dimly lit corridor that led to the back storage rooms. He wanted me completely isolated from Jamal Wyatt and the rest of the wedding party. I let him pull me. I let him believe his physical intimidation was actually working. Thomas shoved me hard against the wooden door of a supply closet. He stepped into my personal space, using his height and broad shoulders to block my path back to the showroom. His chest heaved with suppressed rage as he glared down at me. "Listen to me very carefully," Thomas snarled, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper. "You are going to stop this psychotic behavior right now. You are going to walk back out there, apologize to Paige, and tell her you made up everything about the ring. Then you are going to the bank tomorrow morning." I kept my back against the door, maintaining a completely neutral expression. "The bank," I repeated flatly. "Yes, the bank," he spat out. "Brandon miscalculated the catering budget for the reception. The venue is demanding an additional $50,000 by Friday, or they are canceling the entire dinner service. You are going to take out a personal loan for that exact amount. You will sign the promissory note, and you will transfer the funds directly to Brandon. You owe this family, Nora. You have been a financial and emotional burden your entire life, and it is time you finally paid us back for putting up with you." I looked at the man who called himself my father. "You want me to take on $50,000 of high-interest debt to feed Brandon's delusions of grandeur?" The answer is absolutely not. Thomas leaned in closer. The smell of his expensive cologne was nauseating. "I was hoping you would say that," he whispered, a vile, triumphant smile creeping across his face. "Because I know exactly how to motivate you." He shifted his stance, pointing a stiff finger back toward the main showroom where Jamal was standing. Jamal, the dedicated history teacher. Jamal, the man who worked 50-hour weeks to support my younger sister Emily and their unborn child. "If you do not sign that loan paperwork by tomorrow at noon," Thomas said, his voice dripping with malice, "I am going to make a phone call to the superintendent of Jamal's school district. I play golf with the head of the school board. I am going to file a formal anonymous complaint. I will tell them that Jamal has been making inappropriate racially charged comments to his students. I will say he has been promoting radical, dangerous ideologies in his classroom. I will fabricate a story so damaging, so utterly toxic, that the school board will have no choice but to suspend him immediately pending a full investigation." My breath caught in my throat, not from fear, but from the sheer, unadulterated evil of his plan. You know how these things work, Thomas continued, relishing the power he thought he held. In this social climate, an accusation like that will completely destroy a public school teacher. He will be fired. His teaching license will be permanently revoked. His reputation will be annihilated. He will never work in education again. Emily will lose her health insurance right before the baby is born. They will default on their mortgage and they will lose everything. All because you were too selfish to take out a simple loan for your brother. The sheer depravity of his words hung in the stale air of the supply corridor. He was entirely willing to destroy a young family, to plunge his own pregnant daughter into terrifying financial ruin, just to ensure his golden child had premium appetizers at a wedding reception. The mild amusement I had felt earlier vanished. The strategic patience I had maintained throughout the afternoon evaporated into thin air. Threatening me was one thing. I was a trained operative accustomed to psychological warfare. I could easily handle their pathetic attempts at financial manipulation. But threatening to destroy an innocent civilian, a good man who genuinely loved my sister, simply to extort money for a wedding caterer, flipped a violent switch deep inside my brain. I felt the familiar icy calm of a combat zone wash over me, locking away any residual familial empathy. My expression turned lethal. The mask of the quiet, obedient scapegoat shattered completely. I looked up at Thomas with dead, unblinking eyes. The temperature in that narrow hallway seemed to drop by 10 degrees. I stopped slouching, pushing away from the wooden door. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back and allowing my full height and military bearing to finally show. I looked at him, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as an apex predator, evaluating a highly expendable target that had just stepped into my crosshairs. Thomas mistook my terrifying silence for terrified submission. He smirked, adjusting his expensive tie, utterly confident that his ruthless blackmail had secured his ultimate victory over me. "Have the money wired by noon," he commanded, stepping back to admire his sinister work, "or Jamal's career is dead and buried." I did not answer him. I did not need to. Instead, I slowly raised my left wrist. I looked down at the glowing tactical face of my smartwatch. The digital green numbers flashed brightly in the dim corridor. The 30-minute timer I had mentally started the exact moment Wyatt made his urgent phone call had just hit absolute zero. Right on cue, the atmosphere in the building tangibly shifted. A deep, vibrating resonance began to travel through the polished floorboards, rattling the display cases nearby. Outside the thick glass of the storefront, the unmistakable sound of heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed loudly in the outdoor hallway. It was the distinct, rhythmic marching of highly trained personnel, moving with absolute unified purpose. They were not just walking casually past the luxury store. The deafening, heavy footsteps stopped directly outside the front doors. A split second later, the heavy brass handle turned, and the thick glass doors of the boutique were pushed open with such immense force that the overhead entry bell violently rattled against its metal casing. The air inside the shop instantly froze. 5 figures stepped across the threshold, entirely swallowing the oxygen in the room. Leading the formation were 3 high-ranking military officers wearing immaculate, razor-sharp army dress uniforms. Their chests were heavily adorned with rows of colorful commendation ribbons, gleaming silver paratrooper badges, and solid gold stars that aggressively caught the harsh showroom lighting. Directly behind them walked 2 men in tailored dark charcoal suits wearing tactical earpieces and displaying heavy gold badges clipped securely to their leather belts. They were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The entire tailor shop fell into a dead, terrified silence. The tailors dropped their measuring tapes. Paige ceased her hysterical breathing, her eyes widening to the size of saucers. Susan clutched her luxury shopping bags against her chest, as if they could act as a bulletproof shield. The sheer, overwhelming presence of ultimate federal authority crashing into a civilian luxury boutique sent a shockwave of primal panic through the room. Thomas, recovering from his initial shock, instantly misread the entire situation. His chest puffed out. His posture shifted from the cornered blackmailer I had just dealt with into the slick, connected aristocrat he desperately pretended to be. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and put on his most practiced, charismatic smile. He genuinely believed that the arrival of high-ranking military officials and federal agents was tied to Brandon and his heavily advertised Veterans Support Fund. Thomas thought they had come to present an award, deliver a massive federal grant, or perhaps conduct a high-profile photo opportunity for the charity. He stepped away from me, leaving the dimly lit supply corridor, and marched confidently into the center of the showroom to intercept the commanding officers. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Thomas boomed, projecting his voice so every single person in the shop could hear his manufactured confidence. "It is an absolute honor to have you here. I am Thomas Gallagher, and I assume you are looking for my son Brandon. He is the managing director of the Veterans Support Fund you are probably here to recognize." Brandon, seeing his father lay the groundwork, immediately mirrored the arrogance. He stepped away from the tie rack, smoothing his unbuttoned custom suit jacket, pasting a humble and patriotic smile onto his face. He extended his hand, fully preparing to accept the praise and adulation of the United States military for his fake philanthropic empire. The lead military officer, a silver-haired general with a face carved from granite, did not even blink. He did not slow his rigorous pace. He did not extend his hand to accept Thomas Gallagher's greeting. The general and his two flanking officers walked straight past my father as if he were nothing more than a ghost, entirely invisible and utterly irrelevant. Thomas was left standing in the middle of the expensive Persian rug, with his hand extended into empty air, his charismatic smile freezing into a mask of profound, embarrassing confusion. Brandon took a quick step forward, trying to intercept them, but one of the FBI agents smoothly and aggressively stepped into his path. The agent placed a firm, flat hand directly against Brandon's chest, physically stopping him from taking another step. "Stay exactly where you are, sir," the federal agent commanded. His voice held no warmth, no negotiation, only raw, uncompromising authority. The second FBI agent immediately broke off, walking briskly toward the rear emergency exit, locking it down and taking a wide, tactical stance. The first agent remained planted by the main entrance arms, crossed, effectively securing the entire perimeter. Nobody was leaving this building. The three military officers continued their synchronized march, their polished leather dress shoes striking the hardwood floor in perfect unison. They bypassed the groom, they bypassed the terrified bride. They bypassed the custom suits and the velvet-fitting pedestals. They walked directly toward the dim supply corridor where I was standing. I stepped out of the shadows and into the main lighting of the showroom. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders, dropping my chin, slightly shifting instantly back into the posture of a Tier 1 tactical operator. Jamal watched from the corner, his eyes wide with shock, slowly realizing that the sister-in-law he had always tried to protect was not who she seemed. Wyatt, who had been standing guard by the front window this entire time, snapped his heavy boots together. He stood at rigid, flawless military attention. His eyes locked forward, his massive chest inflated, showing absolute deference to the official protocol unfolding in front of him. The general and the two high-ranking officers stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. They did not speak a single word. The entire room held its collective breath. The contrast between my dark workout gear and their highly decorated formal dress uniforms was stark, yet they treated me like their superior. The general slowly raised his right hand. The two officers beside him mirrored his exact movement. With crisp, sharp, flawless precision, all three commanding officers executed a synchronized military salute. They held it there in complete silence, their hands perfectly angled at the edge of their brows, paying the absolute highest level of official respect to the woman standing in front of them in cheap, unbranded athletic wear. They were saluting me. The collective gasp that echoed through the tailor shop was loud and undeniable. Susan dropped her luxury shopping bags. They hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling designer tissue paper and expensive garments across the hardwood. Thomas stood entirely paralyzed, his jaw hanging open, staring at the military brass saluting the daughter he had just threatened to throw onto the freezing streets. Paige covered her mouth with both hands, shaking her head in complete terrified disbelief. Brandon, however, completely short-circuited. His fragile, carefully constructed ego simply could not process the visual data his eyes were receiving. His reality was breaking, and he desperately tried to glue the pieces back together. "What is this?" Brandon stammered, his voice cracking violently. His face was pale, sweating profusely under the intense shop lights. "What kind of prank is this? Who hired these actors? This is a joke, right? You hired actors to come in here and embarrass me at my own fitting." Brandon looked wildly around the room, demanding someone agree with his delusion. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is a college dropout. She is a broke, unemployed loser. Stop saluting her. I demand to know who put you up to this sick joke." The silence in the room stretched out thick and heavy until Wyatt finally turned his head. Wyatt stepped away from the glass window, his heavy boots breaking the absolute silence that had suffocated the luxury showroom. He did not look at Brandon. Instead, his gaze swept over the bewildered groomsmen, then settled heavily on Thomas and Susan. His expression was forged from a terrifying mixture of profound reverence and white-hot, unadulterated rage. He looked like a man who had just watched a sacred monument being vandalized by foolish, arrogant children. "These are not actors," Wyatt said, his deep voice trembling with a raw, visceral emotion that commanded the attention of every single person in the shop. He pointed a steady finger toward the general and the two high-ranking officers, who were finally lowering their synchronized salute. "They are here to pay respect to a ghost." A legend that most of us in the special operations community thought was an absolute myth. Wyatt turned to fully face Brandon, stepping closer to my arrogant brother. His chest heaved as he fought to keep his composure. "You stand there and call her a college dropout. You call her an unemployed loser. You tell your friends that she sits around playing video games and begging for a monthly allowance. You have spent this entire afternoon degrading a woman who has more courage, more honor, and more blood on her hands for this country than you could possibly comprehend in 10 lifetimes." Brandon opened his mouth to argue, but Wyatt cut him off with a sharp, aggressive slash of his hand. "Shut your mouth and listen to me." Wyatt barked, his military command voice echoing off the mirrored walls. 6 years ago, I was deployed in the Korangal Valley. We were hit hard during a night operation. Our Black Hawk took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. We went down hard in an active kill zone. The tailor shop remained dead silent. Jamal stood entirely paralyzed, absorbing every single word. Paige had stopped clutching her fake engagement ring, her jaw completely slack. "The chopper was a burning metal coffin." Wyatt continued, his voice dropping an octave as the trauma of that night flooded back into his eyes. The heat was unbearable. The enemy fire was a solid wall of lead tearing through the fuselage. My legs were pinned under the crushed seats. 4 of my Rangers were bleeding out beside me in the dirt. We were totally outgunned, outmaneuvered, and waiting for the end. Command told us over the radio that evacuation was impossible. No rescue element could penetrate the ambush. We were entirely on our own. Wyatt stopped and looked directly at me. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. He swallowed hard before turning his attention back to the groomsmen. Then, through the thick smoke and the overwhelming gunfire, somebody sprinted straight into the kill zone. Wyatt pointed directly at me, his finger shaking with intense emotion. It was a covert Joint Special Operations Command medic. She did not wait for authorization. She did not wait for armored backup. She ran through a literal storm of shrapnel and heavy machine gun fire with absolutely zero cover. The heavy artillery from the surrounding ridges was chewing the dirt around her boots to pieces. She ignored it all. She dove into that burning helicopter while the fuel lines were actively melting. Susan put a hand to her mouth, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling violently. Thomas stared blankly, the expensive shopping bags at his feet entirely forgotten. The lie he had cultivated for years. The narrative that his daughter was a deeply flawed, troubled burden was burning to ash right before his eyes. "She dragged me out first," Wyatt said, his voice thick with overwhelming gratitude. "Then she went back in. She went back into a burning inferno 4 separate times. She pulled every single one of my men out of that wreckage. On her final trip, the fuel tank detonated. That is where she got those scars." Wyatt stepped forward, jabbing a rigid finger at Brandon's chest. "You make fun of her arm. You let your shallow fiancé call her mangled. That scar is the result of taking a massive blast of secondary shrapnel and white-hot aviation fuel to shield my body from the explosion. She took the hit so I could live to stand in this room today." She stabilized 5 critically wounded operators in the dirt, while actively returning fire until the extraction birds finally arrived. Wyatt took a deep breath, scanning the terrified faces of my family. She did not fail out of college, Brandon. She was recruited by an elite, highly classified Tier 1 program. She was medically discharged because she gave everything she had to save us. In our community, she is not a freeloader. She is the angel of the Korangal. She is a highly decorated combat veteran, and she holds clearances and commendations that you are not even allowed to read about. The groomsmen were completely floored. The men who had laughed at Brandon's cruel jokes earlier were now staring at me with profound, unmistakable awe. Several of them looked physically sick with guilt for having participated in my humiliation. Jamal looked at me, his chest swelling with immense pride, realizing that the sister-in-law he had always tried to protect was actually the deadliest, most honorable person in the room. The illusion was completely shattered. My parents were exposed not just as liars, but as the cruelest kind of opportunists who had hidden their heroic daughter to preserve a fake narrative. But Brandon could not handle it. He absolutely could not stomach the reality that the spotlight had been violently ripped away from him. He could not accept that the sister he had designated as the family punching bag was actually a giant walking among them. His fragile narcissistic ego completely short-circuited. He felt his power, his dominance, and his entire high society identity evaporating in front of his wealthy friends. Brandon's face contorted into an ugly, desperate sneer. He took an aggressive step toward Wyatt, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "Shut up!" Wyatt Brandon screamed, his voice cracking with panicked rage. "Just shut up! I do not care about some exaggerated war story. I do not care what happened in some desert 6 years ago. You are standing at my wedding fitting, and you are supposed to be my best man. Stop glorifying my freeloader sister. She is still a broken, useless burden who leeches off my parents. She is trying to ruin my life because she is jealous of my success." Brandon glared wildly at the general, then at the FBI agents. "I do not care who you people are. Get out of my fitting right now. You are trespassing. My sister is a liar and a parasite, and I am not going to let her steal my moment." His pathetic outburst echoed through the luxury shop. He genuinely thought shouting louder would bend reality back to his will. He thought he could still control the room by sheer force of his arrogance. But he had just made a catastrophic physical miscalculation. Because insulting a decorated war hero directly in front of the very soldier she had bled to save was the absolute worst decision Brandon Gallagher could have possibly made. Brandon completely lost whatever fractured grip he still held on reality. The sheer overwhelming presence of military brass and the crushing weight of Wyatt's testimony had cornered him. His entire false narrative, the one he had meticulously crafted and fed to his wealthy friends for years, was disintegrating in real time. Instead of backing down or assessing the massive tactical threat standing in front of him, his fragile ego chose violence. He chose the one tactic he had always used when I proved difficult to control: physical intimidation. With a guttural shout of absolute rage, Brandon lunged across the showroom floor. He bypassed the general. He ignored the federal agents. His manicured hands reached out like claws, aiming directly for my exposed right arm, the very same arm bearing the jagged blast scars he had just mocked. He intended to grab me by the wrists, to physically overpower me and drag me out the back door of the tailor shop, just like he used to do when we were teenagers, fighting in the hallways of our parents' mansion. He genuinely believed he still possessed the physical authority to remove the threat from his presence. He never even made it within striking distance. Before Brandon's fingertips could even brush the fabric of my jacket, the air violently displaced. Wyatt moved with the terrifying explosive speed of a Tier 1 operator reacting to an active threat. He did not issue a verbal warning. He did not attempt to de-escalate the situation through dialogue. He simply acted. Wyatt stepped sharply into the path of my charging brother. He dropped his center of gravity, planting his heavy combat boots firmly into the Persian rug. With a fluid, brutal motion, Wyatt brought his massive forearm up, catching Brandon squarely across the chest. The impact sounded like a heavy sack of concrete hitting the floor. The momentum of Brandon's own lunge worked completely against him. Wyatt drove his body weight forward, lifting Brandon entirely off his feet. With a ferocious shove, he launched my arrogant brother backward across the room. Brandon flew through the air, his limbs flailing uselessly. He collided with the massive floor-to-ceiling mirrored wall at the far end of the shop. The impact was deafening. The heavy glass shuddered violently under his weight, a web of spiderweb cracks instantly spidering outward from the point of contact. The expensive half-pinned custom suit jacket Brandon was wearing tore loudly at the seams. Silver pins scattered across the hardwood like hail. Brandon crumpled, sliding down the cracked mirror until he hit the floor in a pathetic, gasping heap. The physical altercation lasted less than 3 seconds, but it entirely shattered Brandon's untouchable persona. The golden child, the self-proclaimed venture capitalist king of Seattle, was currently gasping for breath on the floor of a tailor shop, his expensive clothes ripped and ruined. His groomsmen watched in absolute stunned horror. The illusion of his physical and social dominance had been instantly and violently eradicated by a man who had actually seen real combat. Paige watched her future husband hit the ground, her jaw dropping as the fantasy of her elite, untouchable wedding dissolved into dust. She clutched her fake diamond ring, stepping away from the carnage, her eyes darting toward the exits as her selfish survival instincts kicked in. Jamal, on the other hand, stood tall in the corner. His chest swelled with a quiet, powerful vindication. The man who had mocked his teaching salary and demeaned his race was now cowering on the floor. "Stay exactly where you are," Wyatt roared, standing over Brandon with his fists clenched, his massive chest heaving. "You do not ever touch her. Do you understand me? You do not even look at her." The situation had escalated into active physical conflict, and the federal response was instantaneous. The two men in dark charcoal suits moved with synchronized precision. They abandoned their perimeter positions and stepped aggressively into the center of the room. They threw their suit jackets back, their right hands dropping instinctively to the heavy black holsters resting on their hips. With their left hands, they simultaneously produced solid gold shields, thrusting them forward for everyone in the room to see. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody moves another muscle," the lead agent barked. His voice carried absolute, uncompromising authority. He stepped between Wyatt and Brandon, placing himself squarely in the line of fire. "Back away from the suspect right now." Wyatt took one deep breath, gave Brandon a final look of pure disgust, and took 2 steps backward, returning to his post beside me. He had neutralized the immediate physical threat to my safety. His job was done. The reality of the gold badges finally registered in the room. This was not a private security detail. This was not local law enforcement. This was the federal government, and they had just drawn their weapons in a civilian clothing store. Susan shrieked. The sound was a high-pitched, hysterical wail of a mother who had just witnessed her perfect, untouchable son being violently manhandled. She abandoned her luxury shopping bags completely and sprinted blindly across the showroom floor. Her heels clicked frantically against the hardwood. She was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face, reaching out to grab Brandon and shield him from the agents. "Hi is hurt!" Susan screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a trembling finger at Wyatt. "My son is hurt. You assaulted him. You are all crazy. Someone call the police right now. My baby is bleeding." She tried to push past the lead FBI agent to reach Brandon, who was still coughing on the floor, holding his ribs. The agent did not budge. He raised his hand, placing a firm, unyielding palm flat against Susan's shoulder, stopping her dead in her tracks. "Ma'am, step back immediately," the agent commanded, his voice cold and devoid of any sympathy. "Do not tell me to step back!" Susan screeched, her face turning a blotchy red as she slapped at the agent's hand. "He is my son. You cannot do this to him. We are the Gallaghers. Do you know who my husband is? I will have your badge for this. I will sue this entire department." The lead agent did not flinch at her pathetic attempts to pull rank. He leaned forward, looking Susan directly in the eyes. His expression was deadly serious. "Mrs. Gallagher," the agent said, lowering his voice to a chilling, authoritative register, "if you take one more step forward, or if you attempt to physically interfere with me or my partner again, you will be placed in handcuffs and immediately arrested for assaulting a federal officer and obstructing an active federal investigation. I suggest you step back and remain completely silent. This is your only warning." The words, "active federal investigation," hit Susan like a physical blow to the stomach. The hysterical screaming died in her throat. She froze, her hands still raised in the air, the blood rapidly draining from her face. She looked at the gold badge, then at the serious, unblinking eyes of the agent holding it. She slowly lowered her hand, taking a shaky, terrified step backward. Her entire world was collapsing, and for the very first time in her privileged life, throwing a tantrum and dropping her last name was not going to save her. Thomas had not moved a single inch. He remained glued to the floor near the alcove, his charismatic facade completely destroyed. He watched his wife get shut down by federal law enforcement. He watched his golden boy groveling on the floor. Brandon finally managed to catch his breath. He looked up from the base of the shattered mirror, his eyes wide and panicked. The arrogance was completely gone. The smug, condescending sneer he had worn all afternoon had been entirely wiped from his face. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a pathetic, frightened fraud, who had finally been caught in a trap he could not talk his way out of. "What is going on?" Brandon gasped, clutching his chest and looking pleadingly at the lead agent. "I did not do anything wrong. I was just trying to get my sister to leave. Why are the feds here? You are here for my charity, right? You are here to present the commendation." The sheer delusion required to ask that question made me shake my head. I stepped forward, walking slowly past the general, past Wyatt, and past the FBI agents. I looked down at my brother trapped against the broken glass. "They are not here to give you an award, Brandon," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and merciless. "They are here because I called them, and we are about to discuss exactly what you have been doing with the money I gave you." Brandon stared up at me from the floor, his chest heaving against his torn custom suit. He blinked rapidly, desperately trying to process the impossible words I had just spoken. The money I gave him. His brain simply refused to compute the data. He looked at the lead FBI agent, seeking some sort of rational explanation, a lifeline that would confirm this was all just a massive theatrical misunderstanding. The lead agent did not offer a lifeline. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out a thick, folded federal document. He held it up, the official seal catching the harsh showroom lighting. "Brandon Gallagher," the agent stated, his voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment. "We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant on all physical and digital assets tied to your name, your venture capital firm, and the Veteran Support Fund you currently manage. You are the primary suspect in an ongoing multi-agency investigation regarding aggravated wire fraud, money laundering, and the embezzlement of charitable assets." Brandon scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the scattered silver pins covering the hardwood floor. He pressed his back against the shattered mirror, shaking his head violently. "No," Brandon gasped. "No, this is a terrible mistake. My charity is completely legitimate. I have anonymous backers. I have high-net-worth angel investors who trust me. You cannot investigate me based on the psychotic ramblings of my jealous sister. She has no money. She has no connections. She is a total fraud." I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was towering over him. Wyatt reached into a specialized compartment in his jacket and handed me a sleek military-grade iPad encased in black tactical rubber. I took it, the heavy device feeling familiar and grounding in my hands. "I am not a fraud, Brandon," I said smoothly. "But you certainly are. And those anonymous backers you love to brag about to your country club friends do not exist. There is only one donor." I tapped the screen of the iPad. The bright display illuminated my face as I pulled up the heavily encrypted financial records. I turned the screen toward him, making sure he could see the official corporate logos and the massive balance sheets. "My name is Nora Gallagher," I announced, ensuring every single person in the tailor shop heard me with perfect clarity. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Tactical Solutions. We are a private security and medical logistics firm. We hold high-level defense contracts with the federal government, and our current corporate valuation exceeds $80 million. The collective shock in the room was a living, breathing entity. Thomas let out a strangled gasp from the alcove, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray. Susan swayed on her feet, grabbing a display rack of luxury belts, just to keep herself upright. Paige, the bride, who had just called me a jobless freeloader, looked like she was going to be physically sick. Jamal smiled a slow, immensely satisfied smile, crossing his arms as he watched the ultimate karmic justice finally unfold. Vanguard Tactical Solutions. I continued, my voice sharp and uncompromising, is the sole anonymous benefactor of your so-called Veteran Support Fund. When you launched your pathetic charity 2 years ago, you marketed it as a lifeline for transitioning combat veterans. You promised housing assistance, medical care, and job training for the men and women who bled for this country. I knew you were arrogant, Brandon, but I wanted to believe that maybe you actually wanted to do something decent with your life. So I authorized a corporate grant. I instructed my finance team to quietly inject $2.5 million into your charity over 24 months. Brandon stared at the iPad screen. His eyes darted frantically across the financial routing numbers, the corporate watermarks, and the digital signatures. The undeniable proof of my wealth and authority was staring him directly in the face. His lips trembled, but no coherent words came out. "But I do not write blank checks," I said, my tone growing darker, heavier with righteous anger. "I demanded a full forensic audit of your operation last week. I dispatched Vanguard's top financial analysts to track every single penny of my money. And do you know what they found, Brandon?" I swiped my finger across the glass screen, pulling up a highly detailed, itemized spreadsheet. I read the charges aloud, letting the devastating truth echo off the mirrored walls. "They found that you did not spend a single dollar on veterans' housing," I stated, my voice ringing out like a judge delivering a fatal sentence. "They found that you siphoned $400,000 through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to seed your completely fake venture capital firm. They found $80,000 routed to a luxury car dealership so you could lease that Mercedes you love to parade around Seattle. They found $30,000 spent on first-class tickets to Dubai for you and Paige." Paige whimpered, taking another large step back, as if the physical distance could detach her from the radioactive fallout of her fiancé's massive crimes. "You stole $2.5 million from broken soldiers," I roared, finally letting my anger bleed completely into my voice. "You stole from men like Wyatt. You stole from people who lost limbs and livelihoods, all so you could play the role of a wealthy elite businessman. You built your entire high society identity using my money, and you used that exact same fake status to look down on me and humiliate Jamal." Brandon started to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, shaking his head side to side, trapped in a nightmare he could not wake up from. He looked at the FBI agents, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. "It was a clerical error," Brandon pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. "I was going to put the money back. I was just borrowing it to secure more investments. I swear I was going to refund the charity accounts after the wedding. Mom, Dad, tell them. Tell them I am a legitimate businessman." He looked toward our parents, begging for them to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But Thomas and Susan were paralyzed. The realization that their golden boy was a federal criminal and their scapegoat daughter was a multi-million-dollar defense contractor had completely short-circuited their brains. They had no script for this. They had no leverage. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound cut through Brandon's pathetic excuses. "There are no clerical errors in offshore wire fraud, Mr. Gallagher," the agent said coldly. "The paper trail is absolute. We have tracked the IP addresses, the authorization signatures, and the bank transfers. You knowingly and intentionally defrauded a charitable organization, and you misappropriated funds across state and international lines." I looked down at my brother one last time. The man who had mocked my scars, degraded my service, and threatened to ruin my brother-in-law's career over a catering bill was now a crumpled, weeping mess on the floor of a luxury tailor shop. He had nothing left. His money was fake. His status was a lie. His entire life was a house of cards built on my hidden generosity, and I had just kicked out the foundational pillar. "You thought you were untouchable," I said quietly, ensuring he heard every single syllable. "You thought you could walk all over people because you had a tailored suit and a big mouth. But you forgot the most important rule of engagement, Brandon. You never attack someone until you know exactly who is funding their ammunition." I handed the tactical iPad back to Wyatt. I turned my back on Brandon, signaling to the federal agents that I was completely finished with him. The embezzlement trap had officially been sprung, and the steel jaws had closed tightly around my brother's neck. There was no escape. But the destruction of the Gallagher family illusion was not quite over yet. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly as the lead FBI agent secured Brandon's wrists behind his back. The sharp metallic sound finally broke the paralysis gripping my parents. Thomas and Susan Gallagher snapped out of their shock, realizing their golden child, the foundation of their elite social identity, was actually going to federal prison. The immaculate, wealthy image they had meticulously maintained for decades was collapsing into a spectacular, highly public ruin. Susan let out a strangled, hysterical sob. She abandoned the scattered designer shopping bags on the floor and rushed toward me. She did not approach the federal agents. She knew better than to physically engage law enforcement again. Instead, she threw herself at me, grabbing my jacket with manicured claws. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark streaks across her cheeks. "Nora, you have to stop this right now!" Susan wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the mirrored walls of the tailor shop. "Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them you authorized the transfer. He is your brother, Nora. He is your own flesh and blood. You cannot send him to prison. You are destroying this family." Thomas flanked her, his face flushed with panicked desperation. He had lost all his previous swagger. He was no longer the imposing patriarch demanding obedience. I was a cornered, terrified man begging for a lifeline. "Nora, please," Thomas pleaded, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Brandon made a stupid mistake. He got in over his head in business, that is all. It was a temporary lapse in judgment. We will pay you back. We will sell the cars. We will refinance the house. We will get you every single penny. Just tell these agents to withdraw the charges. You owe us that much for raising you, for giving you a good life." I looked down at Susan's hands clutching my jacket, then up at Thomas's sweating face. The sheer audacity of their gaslighting was almost impressive. Even with federal agents standing right there, even with Wyatt and Jamal watching them unravel, they still believed they could manipulate me through pure weaponized guilt. They genuinely thought pulling the family card would erase $2.5 million of stolen veteran relief funds. I gently but firmly detached Susan's fingers from my jacket, stepping back to create a physical boundary between us. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their hysteria. I maintained the cold, calculated precision of an operative neutralizing a threat. "I cannot withdraw federal charges," I explained, keeping my tone entirely clinical. "The FBI and the Department of Justice do not work for me. They work for the United States government. Brandon committed wire fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. Those crimes belong to the federal prosecutors now. But even if I possessed a magic wand that could make these agents disappear, I would not use it. I would gladly watch him walk into a prison cell." Susan gasped, bringing a hand to her chest, as if I had physically struck her. "How can you be so incredibly cold?" Susan cried, looking around the room, hoping to find sympathy from the stunned groomsmen. "We are your family. We loved you. We took care of you when you came back from the military completely broken. We put a roof over your head. You owe us your loyalty." The absolute delusion of her statement hung in the air. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that made Thomas flinch. My eyes darkened as I looked at the two people who had made my entire existence a miserable conditional transaction. "You took care of me?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper. "Is that the narrative you tell yourselves to sleep at night? Let us talk about how you took care of me, Susan. Let us tell everyone in this room exactly what family loyalty means to the Gallaghers." I turned slightly, ensuring the FBI agents Wyatt and Jamal could hear every single word. 6 years ago, I woke up in the intensive care burn unit at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. I was strapped to a hospital bed, heavily sedated, covered in third-degree burns, and missing pieces of my own muscle from shrapnel wounds. I spent 3 months fighting off massive infections. I had to learn how to walk again. I had to undergo excruciating skin graft surgeries. I stepped closer to my parents, forcing them to look me directly in the eyes. "I was your daughter, and I was fighting for my life in a sterile hospital room. Do you want to tell everyone where you were during those 3 months?" Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the floor. Susan clamped her mouth shut, her tears suddenly drying up as the horrific truth cornered her. "You went on a 6-week luxury cruise through the Caribbean," I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. "You booked a premium suite on a yacht. When the military liaison called to tell you I had been critically wounded in a combat zone, you told him you could not cancel your vacation because the deposit was non-refundable. When I finally woke up and asked the nurses where my parents were, they had to tell me you were unavailable. Wyatt let out a low, disgusted sound from his position near the door. Jamal shook his head, his hands clenching into tight fists as he glared at my parents. You did not visit me once I continued relentlessly pressing the advantage. When I was finally discharged and needed a place to recover, I showed up at your mansion. Do you remember what you told me, Thomas? You told me I needed to find my own apartment because looking at my bandages and my scars was just too depressing for Susan. You said my injuries ruined the aesthetic of the house and made your high society friends uncomfortable. You literally shut the front door in the face of your wounded daughter because I was not pretty enough for your country club dinners. Susan tried to stammer out a defense, her voice weak and shaking. We did not know how to handle it, Nora. We were overwhelmed. We gave you money for an apartment. You gave me silence, I corrected her coldly. You abandoned me when I was completely shattered. You threw me away because I did not fit your perfect elite family image. The only reason I survived was because of the military community. The only reason I built Vanguard Tactical Solutions was because I had to claw my way out of the gutter you left me in. So do not stand here and talk to me about blood. Do not dare invoke the word family. You have absolutely no idea what that word means. I turned away from them, looking back toward the lead FBI agent who was currently securing Brandon's wrists. The truth was out in the open, raw and undeniable. My parents' gaslighting had failed completely. Their desperate attempts to manipulate me with fake affection had shattered against the hard, unforgiving wall of their own past cruelty. They were exposed, stripped of their power, and left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own consequences. And I was far from finished dismantling their world. Thomas stepped forward, his face twisting from panic back into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He could not accept defeat. His narcissistic brain refused to process that the daughter he viewed as a pathetic failure had the upper hand. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. You listen to me right now, Thomas bellowed, his voice echoing off the shattered mirror behind him. You think you can waltz in here with a couple of federal agents and ruin my family? You think your little private security company makes you untouchable? I am Thomas Gallagher. I sit on the board of the most prestigious country clubs in Seattle. I have lunch with state senators. I have a net worth that you cannot even comprehend. I will hire the most vicious, expensive corporate defense lawyers in this entire country. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the rest of your miserable life. I will crush your company. I will bury you in legal fees, and I will make sure Brandon walks out of that courtroom a free man. Do you hear me? I am a wealthy, connected man, and I will completely destroy you. I looked at him. I looked at his custom-tailored cashmere sweater, his imported Italian leather shoes, and the solid gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist. Then I let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound bounced around the quiet tailor shop. It was not a bitter laugh or an angry scoff. It was the unrestrained laughter of someone who was witnessing the greatest comedic performance of the century. You are going to hire the best lawyers in the country, I asked, still chuckling as I shook my head. You are going to crush me with your massive net worth. Thomas stood tall, inflating his chest. Absolutely. You have no idea what real wealth can do. I sighed, wiping a fake tear from my eye. I turned my attention away from my delusional father and scanned the showroom. On the far wall was a massive smart television screen. I pulled out my smartphone, accessed the shop wireless network, and mirrored my display onto the screen. The runway models vanished, replaced by my highly encrypted private banking application. Everyone turned to stare at the television. Let us take a look at this massive net worth. You keep bragging about Dad, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. I swiped my finger across the glass of my phone. A digital file expanded. It was an officially stamped federal court document reading United States Bankruptcy Court. Right below that, in bold letters, were the names Thomas and Susan Gallagher. Susan gasped, slapping both hands over her mouth. Thomas went entirely rigid, his face draining of all color. 3 years ago, I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the federal agents securing the doors. Your commercial real estate investments completely collapsed. You over-leveraged yourselves on 3 luxury developments and lost every single liquid asset you possessed. You filed for bankruptcy in secret because you were terrified your high society friends would find out you were broke. You were 2 weeks away from having the bank foreclose on your mansion. The groomsmen stared in absolute shock. The illusion of the wealthy Gallagher family was being shredded in high definition. Paige looked physically ill. "But you did not end up on the street, did you?" I asked, taking a slow step toward my trembling father. "Somehow your mortgage kept getting paid. Your luxury car leases were covered. And through it all, you still managed to send me a monthly allowance. You reminded me I was a pathetic burden living off your charity. You bragged to everyone that you were generously supporting your damaged daughter." I swiped my phone screen again. The bankruptcy document vanished. A complex financial flowchart appeared showing a web of corporate holding companies and a domestic blind trust named the Vanguard Genesis Fund. "Let me explain how blind trusts work," I said smoothly. "When I found out you were going bankrupt, I knew your fragile ego would never accept money from the daughter you considered a failure. But I did not want Emily to lose her childhood home. So I instructed Vanguard Tactical Solutions to set up a blind trust. I routed my corporate dividends into that trust. It purchased the debt on your mansion and took over your expenses." I tapped my screen one final time. A ledger appeared on the television, highlighting a specific recurring monthly transaction in bright red. "That allowance you throw in my face," I asked, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. "That $1,000 a month you claimed was keeping me from starving. Look at the routing numbers. Look at where the money actually came from." Thomas stared at the giant screen. His eyes traced the highlighted red line showing the flow of funds. "The money originated from my Vanguard account, moved through the blind trust into your empty checking account, and was proudly transferred back to me as my allowance. You never gave me a single dime," I stated, laying out the absolute undeniable truth. "You have not had a dime to give for 3 years. I pay your mortgage. I pay for the cars you drove here today. I pay for the designer clothes you are wearing. You are not a wealthy, connected aristocrat, Thomas. You are a broke, unemployed fraud living entirely on my payroll. You have been secretly funded by the exact same daughter you just threatened to leave homeless on the streets." The silence in the tailor shop was absolute and deafening. Jamal stared at the screen, a massive grin breaking across his face as he realized the people who mocked his teaching salary were entirely penniless. Wyatt stood tall, his arms crossed, watching the righteous execution of my family, fake empire unfold. The magnitude of my revelation crushed whatever fight Thomas had left. He stumbled backward, bumping hard into the display table and knocking over folded shirts. He looked at the television screen, then down at his expensive shoes, and finally over at Susan, who was quietly weeping into her hands. The fake empire they sacrificed their souls to maintain was completely gone. I owned everything they touched, and they finally knew it. The silence following my financial presentation was absolute, but it did not last long. The reality of the situation crashed down on the one person in the room whose entire existence revolved around the illusion of extreme wealth. Paige. She had stood by the clothing racks, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she processed the bankruptcy documents displayed on the smart television. Her wide, panicked eyes darted from my father, who was still staring at the floor in utter defeat, to my mother, who was softly weeping, and finally settling on Brandon. The realization hit Paige with the force of a freight train. She was not marrying a highly successful venture capitalist. She was not marrying into a prestigious, untouchable Seattle dynasty. She was marrying a broke, unemployed federal criminal whose entire lifestyle was secretly funded by the exact same woman she had just demanded be banned from all official wedding photos. The sheer horror of her evaporating social status triggered an immediate and spectacular meltdown. Paige let out a guttural, high-pitched shriek. She marched across the hardwood floor, her designer heels clicking aggressively, and shoved Brandon hard in the chest. Brandon stumbled backward, still handcuffed, his back hitting the cracked mirror again. "You lied to me," Paige screamed, her face contorting with absolute fury. "You told me your family was loaded. You told me you owned half the real estate in this city. I spent the last 2 years bragging to my friends about your trust fund. You let me plan a $200,000 wedding when you do not even have a job. You are completely broke. You are nothing but a pathetic, lying loser." Brandon flinched, desperately trying to salvage whatever fragment of her affection remained. Paige, please listen to me, he begged, his voice cracking pitifully. I can fix this. I have investors lined up. We just need to get through this misunderstanding with the feds. Once my parents get their assets sorted out, we will be fine. I promise you, baby. We are still going to have our perfect life. I stepped forward, deciding it was time to drop the final crushing anvil on my brother's delusions. You are not going to have a perfect life, Brandon, I stated, my voice slicing through his pathetic groveling, and you certainly are not going to fix this. In fact, things are about to get significantly worse for you. Let us talk about the real reason Dad dragged me into that supply closet earlier today. Let us talk about the luxury downtown condo you desperately needed me to sign over to you. Brandon froze. His desperate pleading ceased instantly. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Thomas, who had been staring at the floor, suddenly snapped his head up, his eyes wide with renewed panic. You told Dad to blackmail me into signing that deed transfer today. I continued, pacing slowly in front of him. You claimed you needed it as a wedding gift. You claimed Paige refused to live anywhere else. But that was not the truth, was it, Brandon? You did not want to live in my penthouse. You just needed your name on the deed before the bank caught on to what you had already done. Paige stopped screaming. She looked at me, confusion mingling with her rage. What is she talking about, Brandon? What bank? I kept my eyes locked on my brother. I own that condo outright. There is no mortgage on it. But 3 weeks ago, a local Seattle credit union received an application for a massive high-interest second mortgage using that exact property as collateral. The application requested $600,000 in immediate liquid cash. And the person who signed that application was you. Brandon shook his head violently, pressing himself harder against the glass. You cannot prove that. I never signed anything. You are making this up to ruin me in front of Paige. I did not need to answer him. The lead FBI agent stepped past me. He reached into his suit jacket and produced another heavily sealed document folder. He opened it and pulled out a crisp color copy of a legal contract. We can prove it with absolute certainty. Mr. Gallagher. The federal agent said, his voice echoing with uncompromising authority. You submitted a forged power of attorney document to the credit union. You fabricated your sister's signature, had a fraudulent notary stamp applied, and used her social security number to secure a loan against property you do not own. You needed her to sign the actual deed today to cover your tracks before the bank finalized the underwriting process and discovered you were not the legal owner. The agent held the forged document up for Brandon to see. The digital footprint on the application traces directly back to your personal laptop. The notary seal belongs to a deceased associate of yours. This is not just a clerical error. This is a highly calculated, malicious attempt to defraud a financial institution and steal from a family member. The second FBI agent pulled out a small notepad, clicking his pen with a sharp, terrifying finality. Brandon Gallagher, the agent recited coldly, we are officially adding multiple federal charges to your pending indictment. You are now facing charges for aggravated identity theft, first-degree forgery, and secondary counts of wire fraud. You are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence that just doubled in length. The reality of the situation slammed into the room. There was no spinning this. There was no smooth talking his way out of federal identity theft. Brandon was going to federal prison for a very long time, and he was going to do it completely penniless. Paige let out a sharp, ragged gasp. The illusion she had fiercely protected, the high society aesthetic she had demanded, was entirely dead. She was standing in a tailor shop, engaged to a man who had not only stolen money from disabled veterans, but had also tried to steal a house from his own sister just to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. And worst of all, he had humiliated Paige in the process. Paige looked down at her left hand. She stared at the massive 5-carat engagement ring catching the harsh light of the showroom. The ring she had shoved in my face. The ring I had correctly identified as a lab-grown $850 piece of cubic zirconia financed on my family's stolen credit line. The profound disgust on her face was absolute. She grabbed the ring with her right hand and violently yanked it off her finger. The metal scraped harshly against her knuckle, leaving a red mark, but she did not care. You are a disgusting, broke, pathetic fraud, Paige screamed at the top of her lungs. You are going to rot in prison, and I am not going to waste another second of my life looking at your lying face. The wedding is cancelled. Have a nice life behind bars." With a furious shriek, Paige wound up her arm and hurled the fake diamond ring directly at Brandon. The cubic zirconia struck him squarely in the center of his chest. It bounced off his torn custom suit and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, pathetic clatter. It rolled a few inches before coming to a complete stop right at my feet. Paige did not wait for a response. She spun on her designer heels, shoved past my weeping mother, and stormed out of the shattered tailor shop without ever looking back. The cubic zirconia engagement ring lay dead on the floor. I did not bend down to pick it up. I simply nudged the worthless piece of glass aside with the toe of my sneaker. The sharp scraping sound it made against the hardwood was the only noise in the room until my father finally snapped. Thomas Gallagher had just watched his golden child get handcuffed by federal agents. He had watched his future daughter-in-law sprint out the door. He had watched his entire financial reality evaporate. His aristocratic brain was actively short-circuiting, desperately searching for someone to blame. He could not attack me. I held all the power. He could not attack Wyatt or the military brass. His frantic eyes darted across the room and locked onto the easiest target his prejudiced mind could find. He locked onto Jamal. Thomas lunged forward, his face twisting into a grotesque mask of rage. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my brother-in-law. "This is your fault," Thomas screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "This entire disaster is your fault. I knew the second Emily brought you home that you were going to drag this family into the gutter. You infected Nora with your pathetic, poverty-stricken mentality. You sit around complaining about your public school salary, teaching our daughters to despise real wealth. Nora is acting like a psychotic traitor because she hangs around low-class losers like you." The sheer, unadulterated racism and classism vibrating in his voice made the air in the room turn toxic. Thomas was literally standing in a tailor shop financed by stolen charity funds, defending a son going to federal prison. Yet he still believed he possessed the moral authority to look down on a hardworking history teacher. Jamal stood his ground. He did not flinch. He did not match my father's pathetic hysteria. He just looked at Thomas with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. But before Jamal could utter a single word, I stepped violently into my father's line of sight. "Do not you ever speak to him that way again," I commanded. My voice was a low, seismic rumble that carried the full, terrifying weight of my command authority. "You are standing in the wreckage of your own greed, Thomas. You raised a son who steals from wounded veterans. You spent decades treating Jamal like dirt because of the color of his skin and the size of his paycheck. Look at where your superiority got you. You are completely bankrupt and your son is a federal criminal." I turned my back on my father, dismissing his existence entirely. I walked directly over to Jamal. My brother-in-law was standing tall, his jaw set, his eyes shining with a mixture of shock and overwhelming pride. He had spent years enduring the family bullying, swallowing his pride just to keep the peace for his wife. Today, that peace was being permanently rewritten. "Jamal," I said, allowing the absolute authority in my voice to soften into genuine respect, "you have spent your entire adult life pouring your heart and soul into underfunded public schools. You buy supplies for your students out of your own pocket. You stay late to mentor kids who have absolutely no one else in their corner. You are the only man in this entire room who actually understands what it means to build a legacy. And it is time you were given the resources to do it properly." Jamal blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Nora, what are you talking about?" I smiled, glancing briefly at the stunned groomsmen. "Vanguard Tactical Solutions is highly profitable," I explained, making sure my voice carried clearly. "We secure defense contracts and handle global medical logistics. But our corporate charter also requires significant domestic reinvestment. Up until today, I allowed Brandon to manage that capital through his fake charity because I naively hoped he would do the right thing. Obviously, that was a catastrophic error in judgment. I am permanently liquidating his foundation, effective immediately." I took a step closer to Jamal, placing a firm, supportive hand on his shoulder. "Tomorrow morning, Vanguard is officially launching a brand new corporate initiative. We are establishing a $10 million educational foundation specifically designed to fund underprivileged youth programs, provide scholarships for marginalized students, and build state-of-the-art history and technology centers in the inner city. Jamal's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. He shook his head, struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the number I had just dropped. $10 million, Nora, that is incredible. The impact a fund like that could have on the district is unmatched. Who is going to run it? I looked him dead in the eyes. You are. The entire tailor shop fell into a stunned pin-drop silence. Thomas let out a strangled, pathetic gasp from the background, his racist brain completely short-circuiting at the thought of Jamal managing millions. I am appointing you as the executive director of the Vanguard Educational Foundation, I announced proudly. You are resigning from the public school district tomorrow. Your new starting salary is $250,000 a year, plus full executive benefits and a comprehensive healthcare package that will completely cover Emily and my future niece or nephew. You are getting the corner office on the top floor of the Vanguard building. You will have a dedicated support staff, a corporate expense account, and absolute unchecked creative control over every single dollar in that foundation. Nobody tells you how to spend it. Nobody overrides your curriculum. You are the boss. Jamal literally stopped breathing. The reality of the offer slammed into his chest with the force of a physical blow. A lifetime of financial anxiety, of worrying about medical bills, of swallowing racist insults from his in-laws, evaporated in a matter of seconds. Tears instantly welled up in his dark eyes. He covered his mouth with his hand, his broad shoulders shaking with the overwhelming weight of the moment. Just outside the shattered glass doors of the tailor shop, a figure pushed frantically through the growing crowd of onlookers. It was Emily. My younger sister had rushed to the store after receiving a panicked text message from one of the groomsmen about the federal raid. She burst into the shop, taking in the sight of Brandon in handcuffs, our parents weeping, and me standing tall in the center of the room. She immediately sprinted past the wreckage and threw her arms around Jamal. Jamal pulled his pregnant wife into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder, the tears finally spilling over. He whispered the news into her ear, telling her about the foundation, the corner office, and the massive salary that would change their lives forever. Emily gasped, covering her face as she looked over Jamal's shoulder at me. Tears of absolute, unrestrained joy streamed down her cheeks. For years, Emily and Jamal had been the ultimate scapegoats of the Gallagher family. They had been mocked, isolated, and treated like disposable peasants by Thomas, Susan, and Brandon. In one single decisive maneuver, I had permanently elevated them above the very people who had tried to crush their spirits. The wealth, the power, and the prestige no longer belonged to the arrogant abusers. It belonged to the kindest, most deserving couple in the room. I watched them hold each other, knowing the justice delivered today was finally absolute, but the absolute execution of my family was not entirely finished. While Jamal and Emily celebrated their new reality, Thomas and Susan were still standing by the dressing rooms. They were watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and stubborn denial. Thomas simply could not accept that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. He adjusted his silk tie, trying to summon a pathetic shred of his former authority. He puffed out his chest and pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you can just buy their loyalty?" Thomas yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "You think giving away some corporate money changes the fact that you are a disgrace to this family? You have humiliated us in front of these federal agents. You have ruined your brother. I do not care about your security company or your hidden money. I am still your father. I am cutting you out of my will today. I am cutting you off from this family completely. You will never see a single dime of our estate." I turned away from Jamal and Emily. I walked slowly back to the center of the showroom. I looked at Thomas, marveling at the sheer blinding magnitude of his delusion. He still believed he had an estate. He still believed he had money to withhold. "You are cutting me off," I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "You are going to cut me out of a will that contains absolutely nothing but debt and lies." I reached into my athletic jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the Vanguard Tactical Solutions highly secure executive portal. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh green glow. I bypassed the biometric security check and accessed the master financial control panel. This was the exact panel I used to manage the blind trust that had been secretly keeping my parents out of homeless shelters for the past 3 years. I looked up from my screen and locked eyes with my father. I saw the first genuine flicker of primal fear register in his gaze. "You wanted to cut me off?" I asked smoothly, raising my phone so he could see my thumb hovering over the bright red command icon on the screen. "Let me show you how it is actually done." I tapped the button. A lethal heavy silence hung in the air for exactly 2 seconds. Then a synchronized symphony of digital alerts erupted across the luxury tailor shop. It started with Thomas. His smartphone let out a sharp, aggressive chime from his trouser pocket. A split second later, Susan's phone began buzzing frantically inside her designer handbag on the floor. Then Brandon's phone, sitting on the glass display case where the FBI agents had placed it, lit up with a rapid succession of urgent notifications. The Vanguard Asset Freeze Protocol had been officially activated. It was a complete systematic annihilation of their financial existence executed in a matter of milliseconds. Thomas scrambled to pull his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. He unlocked the screen and I watched the remaining color completely drain from his face. His jaw went entirely slack. His eyes widened in absolute unfiltered terror. Susan dropped to her knees, frantically digging through her purse. She pulled out her phone and stared at the glowing notifications. A high-pitched, hysterical gasp escaped her throat. She looked at Thomas, her face twisted in pure panic. "Thomas," Susan cried out, her voice trembling. "My American Express Platinum card was just declined. I just got a text alert. The account is completely frozen. The bank says our credit limit has been revoked." Thomas did not answer her. He was too busy staring at the alert from Chase Private Client Services. He tapped his screen frantically, trying to refresh the banking application, desperately hoping it was a digital glitch. It was not a glitch. The numbers on his screen remained completely unchanged. "It is all gone," Thomas whispered, his voice sounding hollow and utterly defeated. "The checking account says 0. The savings account says 0. The emergency fund says 0. The bank just sent an automated message stating the primary trust backing our accounts has been permanently dissolved." I took a step forward, commanding the attention of my ruined parents. "I dissolved the Vanguard Genesis Fund," I announced, ensuring my voice carried absolute finality. "I just permanently severed the blind trust that has been paying your bills. Every single corporate dollar I was quietly funneling into your accounts to keep you afloat has been instantly retracted. You are now officially cut off." Susan let out a loud, pathetic sob. She clutched her phone to her chest, looking around the tailor shop as if hoping someone would step forward and fix the nightmare. But the groomsmen just stared at her in disgusted silence. The federal agents remained perfectly still, watching the financial execution with clinical detachment. "Let me be very clear about what your new reality looks like." I continued, my words hitting them like physical blows. "The massive mortgage payment for your suburban mansion is scheduled to auto-draft tomorrow morning. That payment will bounce. Your mortgage will instantly go into default. The bank will initiate foreclosure proceedings by the end of the week. You are going to lose that house." Thomas gripped his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. He looked at me, a desperate, broken man. "Nora, please," he begged, entirely abandoning his previous arrogance. "You cannot do this. We will lose everything. We will have nowhere to go." "You will have exactly what you gave me when I came home from the hospital," I replied coldly. "You will have absolutely nothing. The luxury SUVs you drove here today, the leases were paid by my trust. Since those payments are canceled, the dealership will send repossession agents to collect those vehicles within 3 days. Your country club memberships are terminated for non-payment. Every single credit card in your wallet is now a useless piece of plastic." Brandon, still in handcuffs, slumped against the shattered mirror. He looked at his parents and up at me. The reality of his own situation finally crushed him. The money he needed to hire a top-tier criminal defense lawyer was gone. His parents could not bail him out. They could not afford to hire legal counsel for him. He was going to face federal embezzlement charges using a public defender. He was completely doomed. "You did this to yourselves," I said, looking down at the 3 people who had made my life a misery. "You spent decades treating me like dirt. You mocked my service. You threatened to destroy Jamal's career just to fund a wedding reception. You built an entire empire of lies on my dime, and you had the sheer audacity to treat me like a parasite. Susan fell forward onto her hands and knees. The elegant high society matriarch was now crawling on the floor of a tailor shop, weeping uncontrollably among the scattered silver pins and torn fabric. She reached out, trying to grab my shoes, begging for mercy between loud gasping sobs. "Please, Nora," Susan wailed. "Please turn the money back on. We are sorry. We are so sorry. We will change. We will be a real family. I cannot be homeless. I cannot live on the streets. Please, you are my daughter." I stepped back, ensuring her manicured hands grasped only empty air. I looked down at her pathetic, groveling form. The physical reaction of my parents, their instant transformation from arrogant abusers into destitute weeping beggars, provided the most incredibly satisfying cinematic payoff of my entire life. They were finally feeling the exact same terror, isolation, and helplessness they had intentionally inflicted on me. "I am not your daughter," I said, my voice echoing with absolute uncompromising closure. "I am the CEO of Vanguard Tactical Solutions. I just liquidated a toxic asset, and my company no longer does business with frauds." The asset freeze protocol was complete. The Gallagher family fortune was officially dead, and the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The sweet silence in the tailor shop was abruptly broken by the sharp, authoritative voice of the lead federal agent. He stepped over the scattered silver pins on the hardwood floor and grabbed Brandon by the bicep, hauling him roughly to his feet. Brandon winced, his ruined custom suit jacket hanging off his shoulders like garbage. "Brandon Gallagher," the agent announced, his voice echoing off the remaining intact mirrors. "You are under arrest for aggravated wire fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda warning hit Brandon like a physical blow. The reality of his situation finally breached the thick walls of his narcissism. He was not going to talk his way out of this. He was not going to pay a fine and walk away. He was going to federal prison. Brandon thrashed his shoulders, trying unsuccessfully to shake off the agent's iron grip. He turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward the corner of the room where our parents were currently falling apart. "Dad," Brandon cried out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Dad, do something! Call the mayor. Call your golf buddies. Call the lawyers. You have to stop them from taking me. Tell them this is a mistake." Thomas did not even look up. My father was entirely consumed by the glowing screen of his smartphone. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving rapidly as he frantically tapped the banking application, desperately trying to find a loophole, a hidden account, any shred of wealth that had survived my asset freeze protocol. He swiped his thumb across the screen over and over again, his breathing growing increasingly ragged. The man who had boasted about his vast connections and elite power was now completely paralyzed by a $0 balance. He did not care about his son. He only cared about his own survival. "Mom, please," Brandon begged, tears streaming down his face as the second agent took hold of his other arm. "Do not let them take me. I cannot go to jail. I cannot survive in prison. Help me." Susan remained on her knees on the floor. She was rocking back and forth, clutching her deactivated platinum credit cards against her chest as if they were dying children. She was murmuring incoherently about her country club status and her lost luxury vehicles. The golden child, the son she had worshipped and enabled for his entire life, was actively being dragged away in handcuffs, and she could not even bring herself to look at him. Her money was gone, and without her money, her maternal instincts were entirely non-existent. Brandon stared at his parents, his face twisting in absolute horror as the realization washed over him. They were not going to save him. They could not save him. They cared more about their frozen bank accounts than they did about his freedom. His ultimate safety net was completely gone. "Let us move," the lead agent commanded, shoving Brandon forward. Wyatt stepped over to the heavy glass doors of the tailor shop and pushed them wide open, holding them back to clear a path. He looked at the groomsmen, the wealthy elite friends Brandon had handpicked to stand beside him at his $200,000 wedding. "Clear the way," Wyatt ordered, his voice low and dangerous. The groomsmen scrambled backward, pressing themselves flat against the display cases and clothing racks. They formed a narrow, silent corridor of judgment. These were men who had admired Brandon men, who had sought his business advice and envied his fake lifestyle. Now they looked at him with profound, unfiltered disgust. They realized they had been lied to, manipulated, and associated with a man who stole money from wounded combat veterans. None of them offered a word of support. None of them stepped forward to defend him. They simply turned their faces away as he was marched past them. Brandon was pushed out of the dim, tense atmosphere of the tailor shop and directly into the harsh, unforgiving light of the Seattle afternoon. The busy downtown street was teeming with pedestrians, shoppers, and high society locals enjoying the upscale retail district. The federal agents flanked him tightly, offering no cover, no discretion. They marched him down the center of the wide sidewalk. Brandon tried to lower his head to hide his face, trying to use his torn jacket to shield his identity, but the lead agent kept a firm grip on his shoulder, keeping him upright and entirely visible. The public spectacle was immediate and devastating. People stopped walking. Conversations ceased. The sight of a man in a torn, half-finished luxury tuxedo being frog-marched down the street in federal handcuffs instantly drew a crowd. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Smartphones were pulled from pockets and purses. Camera lenses pointed directly at Brandon. Flashes went off, capturing his tear-stained face and his ruined posture. The social media execution was happening in real time. People began recognizing him from his highly publicized charity galas and society events. This was the exact neighborhood where Brandon usually strutted around like royalty. He frequented the expensive coffee shops on this block. He dined at the exclusive restaurants just across the street. He had spent years cultivating a reputation as a wealthy, untouchable venture capitalist in this very zip code. And now every single person who recognized him was watching him get hauled away like a common criminal. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, filled with shock and mockery as the mighty Brandon Gallagher was paraded through his own kingdom in chains. I stepped out of the tailor shop, standing on the sidewalk alongside Jamal, Emily, and Wyatt. We watched the procession from a distance. The FBI had parked a large black federal SUV right at the corner of the intersection. Its red and blue emergency lights were flashing brightly, reflecting off the glass storefronts and drawing even more attention to the scene. Brandon's legs gave out as they reached the vehicle. He slumped forward, sobbing audibly, completely broken by the public humiliation. He turned his head one last time, looking back toward the tailor shop. His eyes met mine through the crowd. There was no arrogance left. There was no superiority. There was only absolute crushing defeat. The agents did not show a shred of pity. They hauled him back to his feet, opened the heavy rear door of the SUV, and pushed him roughly into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud that echoed down the street. His reputation was officially annihilated. The fake empire he had sacrificed everything to build was burned to the ground for everyone to see. The SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into the Seattle traffic, carrying my arrogant brother away to a federal holding cell, where his designer suits and his massive ego would offer absolutely zero protection. The justice I had waited years for was finally complete. The justice I had waited years for was finally complete. But the cleanup of this toxic disaster was not over yet. I turned away from the glass windows of the storefront. The federal SUV was already out of sight, taking my corrupt brother to a holding cell. I walked slowly back into the center of the upscale tailor shop. Wyatt stayed close behind me, his presence a silent wall of protection. Jamal held Emily tight against his side. They both watched me with eyes full of newfound respect and quiet awe. Inside the shop, the atmosphere was thick with the stench of broken egos. Thomas was still leaning heavily against a display table. He looked completely hollowed out. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had threatened to ruin a high school history teacher just an hour ago was now nothing more than a terrified, bankrupt old man. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a costume he had no right to wear. Susan was still on the hardwood floor. When she heard my footsteps approaching, her head snapped up. Her designer mascara had run down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. The perfectly styled hair she spent hundreds of dollars maintaining every week was now a tangled, disheveled mess. She looked at me, and for the very first time in my entire life, she did not look at me with disgust or disappointment. She looked at me as her absolute last remaining lifeline. Susan scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She crawled right through the scattered silver pins and the torn scraps of Brandon's ruined tuxedo. She reached out with trembling manicured hands and grabbed the hem of my black athletic jacket. Her grip was desperate, her knuckles turning white. "Nora, please," Susan sobbed, her voice a high-pitched, wretched sound that echoed off the mirrored walls. "Please, you have to help us. You are our daughter. You are my little girl. I know we made mistakes. I know we handled things poorly, but we were just scared. We were trying to protect the family name. We can fix this. I promise you we will change. We can go to counseling. We can be a real family now. Just turn the accounts back on. I beg you. Please do not leave us with nothing." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had birthed me. The woman who had actively prioritized a luxury cruise over visiting her combat-wounded daughter in a burn unit. I looked at the hands clutching my jacket. They were the same hands that had slammed doors in my face. They were the same hands that had signed off on countless lies to protect her golden child. A real family. I repeated, my voice devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any sympathy. It was just a cold, flat statement of fact. You think a real family abandons their bleeding daughter in a military hospital. You think a real family gaslights their child for decades to cover up their own catastrophic financial failures. You do not want a real family, Susan. You just want a functioning bank account. You want the Vanguard Trust reactivated, so you do not have to face your country club friends and admit you are completely destitute. Susan shook her head violently, tears pouring down her face. "No, no, that is not true. We love you, Nora. We always loved you. We were just so overwhelmed by Brandon and his business." "Stop lying," I commanded, my voice slicing through her pathetic excuses like a scalpel. "You loved the narrative. You loved the aesthetic of wealth. And now that it is entirely gone, you are perfectly willing to grovel on the floor of a tailor shop." I reached into the inner tactical pocket of my jacket. I did not pull out my smartphone this time. I pulled out a crisp, heavy, legally bound document, enclosed in a thick manila envelope. The legal seal of a top-tier Seattle property law firm was pressed clearly onto the front cover. I held it for a brief moment, feeling the satisfying weight of absolute consequence in my hand. Then I dropped it. The heavy envelope hit the hardwood floor right next to Susan's knees with a sharp, definitive slap. She stared down at it, her tears momentarily stopping as profound confusion took over. Thomas finally lifted his head from the display table. He stared at the envelope, a new wave of dread washing over his pale, exhausted face. "What is that?" Susan whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "That," I said, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room, "is a legally binding 30-day eviction notice." Thomas gasped, taking a stumbling step forward. "You cannot evict us," he choked out, his voice cracking under the sheer weight of his panic. "That is our home. We built that house. We have lived there for 20 years. You lost that house 3 years ago, Thomas," I corrected him sharply. "I bought that house. The Vanguard Genesis Fund holds the master deed to the entire estate. Since I just permanently dissolved that trust, the property ownership automatically transfers directly to my personal portfolio. I am the sole legal owner of the mansion you are currently sleeping in. And as the legal owner, I am officially kicking you out." Susan let out a breathless, horrified shriek. She let go of my jacket and grabbed her own hair, rocking back and forth on the floor in absolute agony. "No, no, you cannot do this. Where will we go? We do not have any money. We do not have any credit. We cannot even rent a cheap apartment." "You have exactly 1 month," I stated, laying down the unyielding terms of their new reality. "You have exactly 30 days to pack up your designer clothes, your fake jewelry, and the pathetic remnants of your fraudulent lives. On the 31st day, my private security contractors will arrive at the property. They will change every single lock on the estate. If you are still inside that house when they arrive, you will be physically removed by law enforcement for criminal trespassing." Thomas fell to his knees beside his wife. He was completely broken. The man who had terrorized me, who had threatened to destroy Jamal's teaching career and ruin Emily's life, was now kneeling on the floor, utterly powerless. "Nora, please be reasonable," Thomas begged, tears finally welling in his own eyes. "We have zero income. We have no savings. If you kick us out, we will literally be on the street. How can you do this to your own parents?" I looked at both of them, absorbing the absolute totality of their destruction. I am doing exactly what you threatened to do to me less than an hour ago, I replied smoothly. You told me you would cut off my allowance and leave me homeless on the streets of Seattle if I did not sign over my condo to your embezzling son. You were perfectly willing to destroy my life, Jamal's life, and Emily's life, all to preserve your fake luxury aesthetic. I am just returning the exact same energy. The only difference is that my threats are backed by actual legal authority. I took a step back, breaking the final invisible tether that had bound me to this toxic family. You have 30 days, I repeated one last time. I suggest you stop crying on the floor and start looking for a place you can actually afford on zero income. The heavy silence that followed my final declaration was broken not by my parents, but by a polite, firm cough. The owner of the bespoke tailor shop stepped out from behind his mahogany cash wrap. He was an older, impeccably dressed Italian man who had been silently watching the entire dramatic execution of the Gallagher family empire unfold from the safety of his register. He surveyed the catastrophic damage to his luxury showroom. The shattered floor-to-ceiling mirror reflected the chaotic scene. The torn remnants of Brandon's custom silk jacket lay in a heap on the floor, surrounded by scattered silver pins and crushed velvet. The owner walked briskly toward Thomas and Susan. He held a leather receipt folder in his hand, much like the one that had started this entire confrontation with Jamal earlier in the afternoon. Mr. Gallagher, the owner, said, his voice clipped and highly professional, completely devoid of the fawning respect he had shown them when they first walked through his doors. We have a serious problem. The credit card your son placed on file for today's extensive fittings and custom alterations has just been declined. I assume this is due to the federal asset freeze we all just witnessed. Furthermore, there is the matter of the destroyed merchandise and the shattered antique mirror. Thomas stared at the tailor, his brain struggling to pivot from the staggering loss of his mansion to a mundane retail dispute. What are you talking about? Thomas mumbled, wiping thick beads of sweat from his forehead. Send me an invoice. I will handle it later. There will be no invoice, the owner replied coldly. Your financial reputation in this city is currently being broadcast on the evening news. You are bankrupt. Your son is en route to a federal holding cell. I am not extending a single line of credit to a family of exposed frauds. The total for the ruined garments, the tailor fees, and the property damage comes to exactly $14,000. I require cash payment in full before you leave this premises. Susan let out another hysterical gasp. $14,000. We do not have that kind of cash on us. Our accounts are frozen. You heard what she did to us. Susan pointed a shaking finger at me, desperately trying to play the victim one last time. The owner did not even glance in my direction. That is not my concern, madam, he stated firmly. You came into my establishment demanding premium service. Your son destroyed my property. If you cannot produce a valid form of payment right now, I am going to lock the doors and call the Seattle Police Department. I will press charges for vandalism, destruction of property, and theft of services. Your son was just arrested by the FBI. I highly doubt you want to end your day in the back of a local squad car. Thomas panicked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather wallet, frantically ripping out a platinum credit card. He shoved it at the owner. Run this one. It is a corporate card. It should still work. The owner took the card, walked to the register, and swiped it. The machine emitted a loud, sharp beep. Decline, the owner called out. Thomas pulled out another card. Run the black card. Decline, the owner repeated seconds later. Every single financial lifeline Thomas attempted to throw was instantly severed by the Vanguard protocol I had activated. He was completely trapped. I do not have the money. Thomas admitted, his voice cracking with the ultimate humiliation of a man who had defined his entire self-worth by his wallet. The owner walked back over his eyes, scanning Thomas from head to toe. Then his gaze locked onto the heavy, solid gold Rolex shining on my father's wrist. He looked at Susan, noting the diamond-encrusted luxury watch gleaming against her skin. Since your digital funds are non-existent, the owner said, his tone entirely uncompromising, I will accept physical collateral. Those 2 timepieces will cover the cost of the damages and the labor my staff wasted on your criminal son. Take them off. Susan gasped, clutching her wrist protectively against her chest. You cannot be serious. This is a vintage piece. It was an anniversary gift. It is worth more than $20,000 alone. The owner crossed his arms. Then you should be grateful. I am willing to accept it as payment for your massive debt. Take them off right now or I am dialing the police dispatcher. Thomas looked at the tailor, then at the shattered mirror, and finally at me. He was hoping for a last-minute rescue. He was hoping the daughter he had abused and discarded would magically step in and pay his tab. I simply stared back at him with a look of absolute glacial indifference. I did not move a single muscle. I was not his savior anymore. I was his reckoning, with trembling, defeated hands. Thomas unclasped the heavy gold Rolex from his wrist. He handed it over to the tailor. Susan wept openly as she unlatched her diamond watch, surrendering the very last physical symbol of her fake elite status. The owner took both luxury watches, inspected them quickly to ensure their authenticity, and slipped them into his pocket. Your debt is settled, the owner declared, turning his back on my parents. Get out of my shop. Do not ever return. Thomas and Susan Gallagher were left standing in the middle of the luxury boutique, stripped of their wealth, their home, their golden child, and their dignity. They had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The elaborate, deceitful stage play they had directed for decades had reached its final humiliating curtain call. I turned away from the pathetic scene. I looked at Jamal and Emily. My brother-in-law was holding his wife close, his dark eyes shining with profound relief and immense gratitude. Emily gave me a tearful, glowing smile. The years of racist insults, financial bullying, and emotional manipulation they had endured from my parents were permanently over. They were free and their future was entirely secure. I looked at Wyatt. The towering former ranger was standing by the door watching me with a look of intense, unwavering respect. He had risked everything to stand by my side today. He had defended my honor when my own blood had tried to destroy it. He was not just a fellow veteran. He was a true ally. Let us go home, I said quietly. Wyatt nodded, opening the heavy glass door and holding it wide for us. Jamal wrapped his arm around Emily's waist, guiding her out of the shop and into the bright Seattle afternoon. I followed them, stepping over the threshold and leaving the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the tailor shop completely behind me. I did not look back at Thomas and Susan. I did not need to see them crawling on the floor or crying over their lost watches. The chapter of my life involving the Gallagher family was officially closed. The heavy glass door swung shut behind us with a satisfying metallic click, sealing away the rot and the lies for good. We walked down the busy street together, a newly forged family bound by loyalty and respect, stepping into a future that finally belonged entirely to us. 6 months passed in a rapid, satisfying blur since we walked out of that tailor shop and into a future that finally belonged entirely to us. The fallout from the spectacular family collapse was swift, brutal, and thoroughly documented by every local news outlet in Seattle. The false empire they had spent decades building on a foundation of lies, and my stolen money crumbled into absolute dust, leaving them buried under their own heavy arrogance. The federal justice system moved with terrifying efficiency when dealing with the theft of charitable funds. His highly publicized trial lasted barely 2 weeks. Without my hidden financial backing, he was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who clearly despised his arrogant attitude. The prosecution presented a mountain of undeniable evidence. They presented the offshore routing accounts, the forged deed application for my luxury condo, and the meticulous financial forensics my company had provided. Brandon tried to take the stand in his own defense, foolishly believing he could charm the jury the same way he used to charm his wealthy socialite friends. It was a catastrophic failure. The federal prosecutor dismantled his fragile ego in under 10 minutes. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts of aggravated wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement of charitable assets. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy at his sentencing hearing. Brandon stood before the court, wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, crying openly as the judge handed down a mandatory sentence of exactly 8 years in federal prison without early parole. There were no luxury accommodations waiting for him. I was immediately transferred to a high-security federal penitentiary, The golden child who once demanded $3,000 custom tuxedos and hurled racist insults at my brother-in-law, now spends his days scrubbing cafeteria trays for pennies an hour, stripped of his name, his status, and his freedom. Paige did not stick around to watch him get sentenced. The moment she realized the venture capital fortune was a complete illusion, she severed all ties. She canceled the wedding, deleted all photos of Brandon, and completely scrubbed him from her history. Her desperation to maintain a wealthy aesthetic led her down a very different path. Stripped of the luxury lifestyle she thought she had secured, Paige downgraded her expectations significantly. She is currently dating a sleazy used car salesman who wears too much cologne and drives a heavily financed sports car. She spends her weekends posing next to inventory vehicles on the dealership lot, pretending she is still living a life of elite luxury, while desperately trying to ignore the reality of her shattered dreams. As for Thomas and Susan, their descent into complete poverty was a masterclass in karmic justice. On the 31st day following our confrontation, exactly as I had promised, my private security contractors arrived at the sprawling suburban mansion. Thomas and Susan were still inside, desperately hoping I would change my mind and reverse the eviction. They were physically escorted off the premises by local law enforcement, carrying only a few cheap suitcases filled with the garments they had managed to salvage. The locks were changed, the gates were secured, and their reign over the estate was permanently terminated. Without my blind trust, paying their bills, they were thrown into a harsh economic reality they were entirely unprepared to navigate. Their credit scores were completely decimated by the bankruptcy and the defaulted loans. No reputable landlord in the city would approve their rental applications. They were ultimately forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a notoriously bad part of town. The building constantly smells of cheap cooking oil and damp carpets. The walls are paper-thin, and the loud sirens of emergency vehicles provide the nightly soundtrack to their miserable existence. The luxurious master suite they once occupied has been replaced by a sagging mattress squeezed into a room barely large enough to hold a single dresser. Their high society friends abandoned them with breathtaking speed. The country club formally revoked their membership, sending a humiliating public notice to the entire board of directors regarding their unpaid dues and fraudulent behavior. The wealthy elites who used to attend their lavish dinner parties now cross the street to avoid making eye contact with them. They have been completely excommunicated from the elite circles they once ruled. Survival required them to get actual jobs. Thomas, the man who used to boast about having lunch with state senators and managing massive commercial real estate portfolios, now works as a part-time greeter at a massive chain hardware store. He stands by the sliding glass doors for 8 hours a day, wearing a bright orange vest over his cheap polo shirts. He spends his shifts handing out shopping carts and directing customers to the plumbing aisle, forced to smile at people he used to consider entirely beneath him. His feet ache constantly, and his massive ego takes a devastating beating every single time a former country club acquaintance walks through the doors and recognizes him in his humiliating uniform. Susan suffered a remarkably similar fate. The woman who used to spend thousands of dollars a week at luxury boutiques and high-end salons now works at a discount dry cleaner located in a strip mall. Her days are spent standing behind a steaming counter, wrapping expensive clothing in thin plastic bags. The harsh chemical fumes have ruined her manicured hands and damaged her perfectly styled hair. She spends her shifts tagging stained shirts and operating the heavy cash register, completely stripped of her aristocratic arrogance. Every time she handles a designer dress similar to the ones she used to wear, the crushing weight of her new reality breaks her miserable spirit just a little bit more each day. They finally received the exact amount of loyalty and respect they had always given to me, which was absolutely nothing, and I felt total peace. That peace did not just heal the wounds of my past, it built the massive, unshakable foundation of my future. Tonight, the grand ballroom of the Seattle Metropolitan Museum is illuminated by thousands of cascading crystal lights, casting a warm golden glow over the most important evening of my life. This is the inaugural charity gala for the Vanguard Educational Foundation. The massive room is filled with genuine philanthropists, dedicated educators, and community leaders who actually care about making a tangible difference in the world. There are no fake billionaires standing around holding empty cocktail glasses. There are no forged real estate documents or stolen charitable funds hiding behind expensive designer suits. Every single dollar raised in this room tonight is completely transparent and dedicated entirely to the underprivileged youth of this city. We have already secured enough funding to build 3 new state-of-the-art technology centers in the most neglected public school districts in the state. The air in the room is electric, vibrating with genuine hope and shared purpose. We are making history tonight, and we are doing it with complete integrity. I stand near the front of the stage watching the incredible manifestation of that vision come to life. I am watching a man who was once relentlessly mocked by my arrogant father and brother step up to the polished wooden podium. Jamal commands the stage, and the entire ballroom falls into a respectful, eager hush. He is not wearing a cheap polyester rental suit forced upon him by a cruel narcissist. He is wearing a flawless charcoal gray bespoke tuxedo tailored perfectly to his broad athletic shoulders. He bought it with his own hard-earned money from his very first executive paycheck. He looks incredibly sharp, distinguished, and utterly confident. He adjusts the microphone and begins his keynote address. His deep, resonant voice echoes through the massive hall, carrying the unmistakable passion of a man who has dedicated his entire life to lifting others up from the bottom. He speaks eloquently about the vital importance of funding public education, about creating safe, innovative spaces for marginalized students, and about tearing down the systemic barriers that hold brilliant children back from their true potential. The wealthy crowd is completely captivated by his raw authenticity and his undeniable leadership. Hai is a natural-born executive, and he is commanding the room with absolute effortless grace, proving to everyone that true class has absolutely nothing to do with inherited wealth. Sitting in the very first row, directly in front of the podium, is my younger sister Emily. She looks absolutely radiant tonight. She is wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown that perfectly highlights her growing baby bump. Her hands rest gently over her stomach as she watches her husband absolutely dominate the stage. Tears of sheer joy and overwhelming pride glisten brightly in her dark eyes. For years, she was forced to watch Jamal swallow racist insults and endure brutal humiliation just to keep the peace at our toxic family dinners. She spent her entire life shrinking herself, trying desperately to fit into the dark, suffocating shadows cast by our abusive parents and our narcissistic brother. But tonight, she is sitting in the front row of a massive gala, glowing with pure, unadulterated happiness, surrounded by powerful people who deeply respect the man she loves. I look at her, and I know with absolute certainty that the cycle of generational trauma in our bloodline is permanently broken. The child growing inside her will never know the crushing weight of conditional love. That child will never be treated as a prop or a scapegoat. That child will grow up in a home filled with genuine warmth, absolute support, and boundless opportunity. I feel a strong, warm hand wrap securely around my fingers, pulling my attention away from the stage. I turn my head and look up into the steady, fiercely loyal eyes of the man standing firmly by my side. Wyatt is wearing a classic black tuxedo that barely contains his massive, muscular frame. He does not just look like a former ranger tonight, he looks like an absolute king. His thumb gently brushes against the sensitive skin of my wrist, tracing the very edge of the jagged shrapnel scar that my brother and his superficial fiancée once called a disgusting liability. Wyatt does not hide my scar. He does not ask me to pull my sleeves down to preserve a high society aesthetic for the cameras. He holds my hand openly and proudly, anchoring me to the beautiful present moment. He is my protector, my partner, and my absolute equal in every conceivable way. We survived the absolute worst of human nature on a burning battlefield in the Korangal Valley, and we survived the treacherous emotional battlefield of my own toxic family. We built a beautiful, unbreakable life from the ashes of our shared trauma. I lean my head against his broad shoulder, and he kisses the top of my head, pulling me closer to his side as the crowd breaks into applause. As the entire ballroom erupts into a thunderous standing ovation for Jamal, I look around the spectacular venue and reflect on the profound journey that brought me here. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable, sacred bond. We are taught to endure unimaginable emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and psychological warfare, simply because the people holding the knives happen to share our genetic code. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, to keep the peace, to protect the fragile reputations of people who would gladly watch us drown if it meant keeping their own clothes dry. But that is a devastating toxic lie. Blood does not make a family. Genetics do not give anyone a free pass to destroy your mental health or exploit your hard-earned success. True family is built on a solid foundation of unwavering loyalty, profound respect, and radical honesty. Family is the brother-in-law who stands fearlessly between you and a screaming entitled bride. Family is the sister who cheers for your victories instead of secretly plotting your downfall. Family is the brave soldier who looks at your deepest, ugliest wounds and sees only unparalleled strength and profound beauty. I spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table that was actively poisoning me day after day. The moment I finally walked away and stopped begging for their scraps, I realized I had the supreme power to build my own table. I built a massive table, and I filled it only with people who actually deserved to be there. I am no longer the family scapegoat. I am no longer the broken casualty hiding in the shadows of my brother's fake empire. I am the sole architect of my own incredibly beautiful reality, and nobody will ever take that away from me again. Jamal finishes his powerful speech, and Wyatt smiles down at me, knowing that every single battle we fought was worth it to get to this exact moment. The lights shine down on us, reflecting a future that is brighter than I ever could have imagined. We are moving forward together, leaving the darkness permanently behind. Family isn't about hiding each other's rot. It's about standing by the people who honor your scars. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.